Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. There are lives that passed without record, ordinary and whole, and what remains of them drifts gently toward you now as you close your eyes. His name was Run, and on a mild afternoon in early autumn, he was somewhere most people never had reason to go, wedged between the heavy beams of an old temple roof in the closed, particular silence that only the interior of very old ceilings seems to hold. The temple sat at the edge of a small town in western Japan, and it had stood there, in one form or another, for longer than any written record in the local archive could reliably confirm. Its curved roof silvering slowly with lichen, its wooden floors worn to a smooth patience by the passage of centuries of feet. Run was 23, and he had been apprenticed to a carpenter for 4 of those years. And one of the first things his master had shown him, among the more practical lessons about grain direction and the seasonal swelling of timber, was that the most interesting parts of any old building were the parts no one thought to look at. The undersides of floors, the spaces behind old plaster, the narrow hollow between what people saw when they looked up and what actually held the whole thing together. These are the places where a building kept its honest record, unmarked by display or intention. He had a small battery lantern with him, and he moved it slowly along the main beam, tapping every few feet, listening for the soft yielding of rot or the firm resistance of wood that had held for a very long time and meant to keep holding, marking quiet notes on a small pad tucked in his breast pocket. It smelled, up here, the way closed spaces smell when they have been closed for a very long time, cedar and dry earth, and something faintly resinous that had no name in any product catalog, and that Ren had come to think of privately as the smell of duration itself, the scent of something that has lasted without being attended to, without anyone noticing it was lasting. The afternoon light came in through 2 small gaps in the old roof tiles above him, thin and slanted and golden in the way that early autumn light gets golden when it decides to, and it fell just far enough to graze the top of the main beam and leave everything else in a shadow that had been accumulating uninterrupted for a very long time. He had been at work for the better part of an hour when the back of his hand brushed against something that was not wood. He stopped. Pause. Not with alarm. There was nothing alarming about it, but with the simple, undivided attention you give to a wrong note, the way the ear comes back to it without being asked. He brought the lantern slowly into the narrow space where 2 beams met at a slight angle, just below the highest point of the roof, and there, settled into the irregular hollow where the timbers crossed, he found it. A package small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands, wrapped in what appeared to be several layers of oil paper. The paper having turned over the years, many years, clearly the amber-brown color of very old tea, the color of something that has been sitting in patience for longer than patience usually lasts. It was bound with something that had once been string and was now a kind of fiber archaeology, its original color surrendered long since to the same slow process that had changed everything else up here, its structural purpose still just barely fulfilled. Ren reached for it with the deliberate gentleness he used for all old things, the professional instinct that what has lasted a long time is usually worth treating carefully until you understand what you're dealing with. It had weight. Pause. Not the weight of stone or metal, but a dense and purposeful weight. The weight of something placed with intention rather than abandoned without thought. Something that had been brought to this exact spot by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it carefully. He settled back on a beam, one leg on either side of the timber, the way a child sits astride something patient and immovable, and he rested the package on his knee and looked at it in the lantern light for a moment without doing anything else. The oil paper was intact, some darkening at the corners, some settled creasing from the original folding, but had done its work through everything the years had sent through these walls, and the thing inside was dry and whole and still, after all this time, held together. He unwrapped it slowly, peeling back each layer of oil paper as though each one might matter, which he supposed it might, though he could not yet have said why or to whom. The layers came away with a faint dry sound, a sound like something taking its first long breath after a very long time of waiting. And when the last fold fell back, he found himself holding a small hand-sewn booklet, its covers cut from thick paper the color of old ash, its pages thin and closely written, giving off the particular smell of very old ink, that smell that is partly mineral and partly something else. Something that belongs to the materials and also, faintly, to time itself. He opened it to the first page. The writing was in Hana, the syllabary script he had learned as a small child, the script that every Japanese person learns first before anything else. Neat and narrow, written with the care of someone who had intended to be legible but had been trying to use as little space as possible, as though the writing itself had needed to remain small, unobtrusive, hard to see unless you were already looking. Breath. He read the first line slowly, the way you read something when you're not certain it belongs to you, his lips forming the syllables quietly, his voice barely present at all. The sounds meant nothing. Not in the way that difficult texts sometimes withhold their meaning on a first reading, not a matter of vocabulary or context, but more fundamentally than that, as though these sounds had been assembled by someone who had heard language, heard it very carefully, and recorded it with great fidelity, and had arrived at something that was almost but not quite any language Ren had ever encountered. Something that felt like the memory of language rather than language itself. He turned a page, and another, reading quietly as he went, feeling the mild, persistent strangeness of the syllables without yet having anywhere to put that strangeness, and something in the careful, narrow script, the deliberateness of each stroke, the sense of someone writing as though each character might be the last they were ever permitted to form, began to trouble him in a way that had nothing to do with understanding. And then, on what he thought was the third page, he would not be entirely certain later, he noticed a mark in the narrow margin. Pause. Very small, drawn in what seemed like a slightly different ink, and so faint that a faster reader would have moved past it entirely. A mark that could have been a slip of the brush, a stray stroke, an accidental line made by a hand that had momentarily lost its concentration. He looked at it for a long moment. A cross, 4 arms meeting at a center, plain and unadorned, no larger than a fingernail, pressed into the margin of this handwritten text, in the ceiling of a Buddhist temple, in a hollow between beams that had been sealed from the world for longer than he could yet guess. Ren sat very still, the lantern throwing its pale light across the open page, and he felt the comfortable certainty of his ordinary afternoon dissolve quietly into something more unsettled. Not frightening, but the particular unsettled feeling that comes from holding a question you do not yet have the terms to formulate. He was not a historian, did not carry the knowledge that would have named immediately what a cross in this context meant, did not know about the families in this region who had, for generations beyond any living memory, hidden one faith inside the outer form of another, did not know the word for it, Kakur, Karishidan, the hidden Christians, the ones who had made themselves invisible by becoming, on the surface, exactly what the world required. He only knew what he felt, which was the feeling of having stumbled, in the course of a perfectly ordinary afternoon, into the presence of something that had once mattered enormously to someone, at a cost he could not yet measure. Pause. The beam held him steadily, as it had held this building for 300 years, and the dust settled around him in its long, untroubled drift, and the afternoon outside continued its ordinary work of becoming later. He looked at the writing again, at the careful phonetic rendering of sounds he could not identify, and the small cross in the margin caught a slant of the lantern light and held it briefly, and then the angle shifted and the mark went back to being almost invisible, which he somehow understood was exactly how it had always preferred to be. And then, because he was 23 years old and alone in the dim upper air of an old building, and because the human impulse to give voice to mysterious words is older than writing itself and very difficult to resist, he read aloud. It was barely louder than a murmur, the instinctive volume of someone alone who still feels that the surrounding air deserves a certain courtesy. His voice low and unhurried in the enclosed space between the beams, the words forming in his mouth and traveling a small distance, and then settling into the cedar air around him. The first line came carefully, each syllable given its own space, his mouth unfamiliar with the exact shapes these particular sounds required. Not hard exactly, but precise in a way that was different from the precision of familiar words, as though each sound was asking something slightly unusual of the tongue and lips. Then the second line, a little smoother, the sounds beginning to belong to each other in the way that repetition creates belonging. And somewhere in the third line, something shifted, nothing he could have named, nothing he could have pointed to or demonstrated to anyone, but in the quality of his own voice as he formed the sounds, a faint resonance, something in the old cedar beams around him or in the enclosed air between them, as though the syllables had located a frequency the space had been holding in reserve, the particular shape that fitted the particular hollow. Breath. He stopped. Pause. He stayed very still, the booklet open across his knees, and the silence after his voice was a different kind of silence than the silence before it, fuller, or perhaps simply more recently vacated. The way a room is different after someone leaves it even when nothing visible has changed, and you cannot say exactly what the difference is, only that it is there. After a moment, he read the third line again, more slowly, giving each sound its full weight, letting his voice find a rhythm that seemed to belong to it. And again that faint resonance came, something in his chest, somewhere behind the breastbone, the physical sensation of sound fitting a shape it had been made for, though the making had happened very long ago, and the fitting had been lost and was only now, without ceremony or announcement, found again. The workers on the roof above him continued in the sounds of their ordinary afternoon. Occasional footsteps, muffled voices, the scrape of material against old tile, and the hall below went on being empty and cool and patient, and everything outside the small compass of Ren's position between the beams continued exactly as it had been, and none of this had changed. And yet he felt, with a clarity he could not account for, that the air around him had received something. He did not know, had no way of knowing, no frame to place the knowledge in, that the sounds he had just spoken aloud were the Hana transcription of a Latin prayer, the phonetic record of words heard by living ears sometime in the middle of the 16th century, taken down in memory by someone who did not speak the language, but understood their weight, passed through whispered transmission across several generations before being committed, at last, to paper by a hand that was the last in. The chain. He could not have known that every person in the long custody of this prayer, from the first man who heard those words and tried to hold them in his memory, to the woman who taught their rhythm to her grandchild late at night with the doors closed, to the one who finally wrote them down and wrapped them carefully and tucked them here. Every single one of them had spoken these sounds in silence, or below silence, lips moving without breath. Because in the years when this booklet was young, to be heard saying such words was to risk everything that a family had and was. Not one of them, in 400 years, had spoken these words in a voice that carried. Pause. Until now. Until this quiet afternoon in early autumn, when a young carpenter in work clothes sat between the rafters of an old temple and murmured a very old prayer into the dusty cedar air, not knowing what it was, and the beams around him held the sound the way old would hold warmth, briefly and without comment, and then let it go. He read on, turning the pages slowly, not hurrying, giving each page its full attention in the way that the writing seemed to ask for, each line of kana rendering its strange phonetic text, each marginal annotation in its cramped and deliberate secondary script waiting to be read. The marginal notes were in Japanese, a formal register that he could follow without difficulty. The voice of someone writing something down for the last time, without expectation of being answered, without any particular audience in mind except the future, which is the most uncertain audience of all. Breath. There was a line that said this prayer had been learned from a father who had learned it from his mother, and that some of the sounds were uncertain, and that the writer was sorry for any error, an apology offered to no one in particular, or to whoever might be listening, across whatever distance of years. There was a line that said the family had kept this faith for 7 generations, and that no priest had come to this region in longer than any of them could remember, and that they had managed, the ordinary Japanese word for managing, for getting by, for doing what needed to be done with what was available, as best they could. There was a line that said the writer was old and had no one to pass this to, and was leaving it here in the hope that someone would find it someday and understand that it had been kept carefully by people who cared about keeping it for a very long time. Rin sat with these sentences and let them settle in him, in the way that things settle when they have been read slowly and in silence, in a way that sentences sometimes need a moment before they give up what they are carrying. Pause. The afternoon light through the tile gaps had shifted while he read. The slant of it steeper now, the gold in it thicker, the particular gold of early autumn afternoons that have decided to move toward evening and do not intend to be hurried about it. He thought about the hands that had wrapped this in its oil paper. Careful hands, patient hands, the hands of someone old who had something important to protect and was no longer certain there was enough time, placing it in this exact hollow between these exact beams in the ceiling of the very temple whose records would show this family as loyal and unremarkable Buddhists of long standing. Hidden in plain sight, in the nearest and least suspected place, tucked into the body of the institution whose authority required the hiding. There was something in that, a kind of dark practicality that had held for 400 years and had only now, at last, been found. He thought about what it would mean to pray in silence for 7 generations, to carry a practice whose words you could not speak above a breath, whose original meanings had faded from any living memory into sounds without translation, whose continuation was an act of faithfulness to something you could not fully explain and could not quite let go of. He could not fully imagine it. He was, by any standard he understood, entirely free to speak any words in any voice, free to believe anything or nothing, free to sit in these rafters and murmur a Latin prayer into the cedar air without consequence of any kind, free in a way that the people who had placed this booklet here had never been and could not have let themselves imagine. There was something strange in that, a kind of quiet vertigo to be the accidental inheritor of a freedom that was paid for by generations of careful silence, by people who had learned to be small and hidden and patient in the practice of the one thing they would not surrender, not because they were told to hold it, but because by the time it came to them, letting go was no longer something they knew how to do. Pause. One of the marginal notes had mentioned a name. The first of the 7, a man called Yoichi, who had lived in this region when the prohibitions came, who had made the quiet decision to keep what he believed by hiding it inside the outward form of everything that was required of him. Yoichi. Ren said the name quietly, barely above breath, and thought about a man who had held 2 things at once inside the same life. The daily practice of one faith in plain view, and the nightly practice of another in the dark behind closed doors, the 2 eventually so intertwined that they became not a contradiction, but simply the texture of a long and carefully managed existence. He could not imagine that precisely, but he could feel the shape of it, the way you can feel the shape of something in the dark without being able to see it, the weight of a life that had been lived in layers, each layer necessary, each one a kind of truth. He read aloud one more time, returning to the opening of the text, his voice quieter than before, more settled, moving through the syllables with an ease that had not been there at the beginning, as though the sounds had loosened slightly from their strangeness over the course of the afternoon and become something his mouth could carry naturally, without the careful negotiation of a first encounter. Breath. When he reached the first spacing in the text, and the kana gave way to a deliberate silence on the page, he stopped and let the quiet come back in, the quiet that was by now a different quiet from the one he had started with. It was the silence of something completed rather than interrupted, the the silence that follows a thing that has run its course. And he sat in it for a while, the booklet resting closed between his palms, the lantern warm beside him on the beam, the dust in its long drift around him, the afternoon going on being afternoon outside the old tiles. Pause. Then he began to rewrap it, slowly, folding the layers of oil paper back as carefully as he could, trying to reconstruct the original packaging, though he knew he could not quite reproduce the 400 years of settled creases, could not replicate the exact angle of each fold as the last hands had left it. He could only try to honor the intention, which was to protect what was inside, and that at least he could do. He would take it down. He would show it to his master first, and then to whoever dealt with such things. A researcher, perhaps, or someone from the local history office, or a university department that knew what to do with a hand-sewn booklet of Hana-transcribed Latin prayers found between the rafters of a centuries-old Buddhist temple. It would be studied and cataloged and given its place in the record, and the story of this family, of Yoichi and the 6 generations that followed him, carrying the silence forward through the years, would eventually be known and told and given its name in the account of what had happened quietly in this part of Japan. All of that would happen, and it was right that it should. Pause. But for this last moment, before he climbed back down to the ordinary world below, for the last few minutes of amber afternoon light between the old cedar beams, Rin simply held it. He held it against his chest and felt its weight, which was the weight of all the years it had waited here and all the voices that had almost spoken and had chosen, with great care and at real cost, not to 7 generations of people who had decided that silence was the price worth paying for continuation, and had paid it year after year, night after night, without acknowledgement and without complaint. He had not meant to do anything important this afternoon. He had come up here to tap beams and take notes, to do the invisible part of an ordinary job, and he had done that. And somewhere in the middle of it, he had found something and had read it aloud, not knowing what he was reading, in the simple way that people read things aloud when they are alone and the words are in front of them and no one has told them not to. And yet, without knowing it, he had given back to the open air what had been kept from it for 400 years. The sound of those words, spoken in a voice, in a room, belonging to a living throat and a living afternoon. Not much, perhaps, as the measure of history goes. And somehow, in a way that was hard to put any words around, everything. Long pause. The light through the tiles was going now, the gold of it fading into the softer, less directional light of early dusk, and the beams around him went on being what they had always been, old and patient and steady, holding everything up without acknowledgement or complaint, the way old things do. Rin tucked the rewrapped booklet carefully under his arm, found the top of the ladder, and began to climb down slowly, the rungs creaking in their familiar way, the transition from the close cedar air of the rafters to the cooler, more open air of the storeroom below coming over him gently, like surfacing from something. When his feet touched the floor, he stood for a moment in the ordinary light of the ordinary late afternoon. The sounds of the town coming in at the edges of the old walls, the smell of incense from the main hall drifting faintly through the closed door, and he breathed. And that, for tonight, is where this story finds its beginning. in the quiet weight of a booklet in a young man's hands, in the cedar-scented afternoon of a very old temple, in the 400 years of careful silence that had come, at last, gently and entirely by accident, to its end. And so we leave that hallway behind. Let it drift back into the soft dark where all stories rest. You do not need to hold on to it. Simply breathe out slowly and feel the quiet settle a little deeper around you. There is no hurry here. The night is long and generous, and it belongs entirely to you. Our next story is the same story continuing. The same night still unfolding, one breath at a time, one quiet moment opening into the next. Let your shoulders fall. Let your thoughts grow slower, softer, like water finding its level. We are still here. We are not going anywhere. What weighed on him was the question of what would remain in the house afterward, and whether the remaining of it was faithfulness or only a way of telling himself a more comfortable story about a choice he knew he was already going to make. He said something along these lines to Emmy, not in quite these words, but the shape of it was there, and she listened without looking up. Then she rose without speaking and went into the inner room, and Yoichi sat in the lamplight listening to her moving carefully among the things kept there, and after a while she returned. She was carrying something wrapped in a piece of old cloth. Its color faded nearly out of existence over years of careful folding, and she placed on the tatami between them with the deliberate attention of someone putting down something that should not be dropped, and then gently opened the cloth. Inside was a small carving, perhaps the length of Yoichi's hand from heel to fingertip, made from wood that had darkened over many years with age and with the oils of many hands. It showed a woman seated, a child held against her. The child nestled as if sleeping, the woman's hands open and cradling rather than grasping. The whole arrangement of it quietly at rest, the face inclined gently downward toward the small figure in her arms. The carving had come to Yoichi from his grandmother, who had received it from her own grandmother before her, who had said only that it came from somewhere far away, from before the years that no one liked to speak of, and that it was to be kept and kept and kept again, with no further explanation given. To Yoichi, it was simply the figure he had known all his life. He knew the weight of it, the cool smoothness of the wood, the way the shadows settled differently in the woman's face depending on where the lamplight was coming from. He had understood, growing up, without anyone ever quite saying so in plain words, that this was not canon. Not the Bodhisattva of mercy who also appeared sometimes as a woman holding a child, though the resemblance, in the most general way, was there. It was something older, or something from another direction entirely, something that had been carried across a great distance, and then kept by being hidden in plain sight, like a word in a language that has been forgotten, but whose sound still survives in the throat. Emmy said, quietly, that they could do what the month required, could go to the temple, give their names, receive the letter, and come home, and this could remain. She rested the very edge of one finger on the carved wood, the lightest possible contact, as if she were only confirming it was still there. Yoichi looked at it for a long time. He found himself thinking about a man who had been part of his congregation some years ago, who had lived 3 villages over and had moved away, or been moved, in a way that people sometimes were moved without explanation, who had once told Yoichi, speaking the way one speaks of things that cannot quite be said directly, that faithfulness of the heart was not the same thing as ceremony performed under compulsion. The man had believed that what a person held in the heart could not be inscribed into any register by any official with any brush, and could not be struck from it either, that the inner record and the outer one were simply different kinds of documents belonging to different jurisdictions entirely. Yoichi had kept this idea at some distance when the man first offered it, had treated it as the sort of convenient thing one believes when one wants hard choices to feel easier than they probably deserve to be. But sitting now in his own house, with the night outside and the lamp between them and the carved woman resting on the cloth, he found he had gradually, without quite deciding to, stopped arguing with it. Perhaps the simplest way of putting it was this: you do what is required to keep living in the world as it is. You keep what can be kept, and you do not let the keeping be undone by guilt about the surviving. Emmy, he came to feel, had arrived at this understanding well before he had, and had come back into the room not to present him with a problem, but with the resolution already held quietly in her hands. He nodded once, slowly, and she rewrapped the figure in the old cloth and held it a moment in both palms, feeling the familiar density of it. Then they both looked at the altar, the low wooden altar his father had built, the gilded face of Amida, the offerings, and Yoichi considered the narrow gap at the altar's back, the space between the rear panel and the wall, where the plaster was slightly uneven and left a shadow. He took the wrapped figure from Emmy's hands and moved to the altar and knelt. With careful, deliberate hands, he reached into the gap behind the altar's back, the narrow space between the wood and the wall, and placed the carving there. It settled without difficulty, resting against the back wall in the narrow dark with the ease of something that has found the place made for it. He withdrew his hands slowly and sat back on his heels and looked at the altar, the gilded face, the cup of water, the cold stub of incense. And the altar looked exactly as it had always looked. Emmy knelt beside him, and they remained there together without speaking. The altar held, now, two truths in the same small space, and from any angle a person standing in the room might look, there was only one visible thing. What Yoichi felt, withdrawing his hands from that narrow space, was not quite the relief he had perhaps half expected, nor was it quite the guilt he had half feared, but something quieter than either, something without a clean name. The feeling of putting a very heavy thing down in the right place after a long carry, the ache of the carrying still present in the arms, and the rightness of the resting also present, both things at once, neither erasing the other. They stayed before the altar a little while longer, neither praying in any particular form, only attending, giving the moment the weight of their full presence before turning away from it. Then Emmy rose and went to the kitchen fire, and he could hear her there, the familiar small sounds of the evening resuming, the shift of wood, the breath of the pot, and he remained alone a little longer. He was not praying, not in any form he could have described, only attending to the space behind the altar, holding in his awareness the way one holds warmth in cupped hands, careful not to lose it by pressing too hard. He thought about the carved woman resting in the narrow dark behind the altar, and about the officials who would arrive at the end of the month with their brushes and their columns of names, and about how those two things could occupy the same small house at once, quietly, without resolving into each other. The officials would come, and he would stand before them steadily, and they would write his household into the column, and then move on, and the house would be the same house, the same altar, the same lamp, the same sound of the river coming through the shutter at night. And behind the altar, in the dark, the carved woman would be resting with her child, as she had always rested somewhere in the keeping of this family. Hand to hand, year to year, carried through years in which the world changed its shape around the carrying without disturbing what was being carried. The next morning, Yoichi walked with his neighbor up the hill to the temple, and the official assigned to their district, a young man from the provincial seat, precise and efficient, with a careful way of holding his brush, entered each household into the column without looking up very often. Yoichi gave his name and bowed when it was appropriate to bow, and the official wrote what he wrote with a small practice motion, the stroke of someone filling out a form he had filled out many times in many villages before this one, and would fill out many times again in the villages ahead. There was nothing notable in any of it. No particular heaviness in the room, no trembling, only the quiet sound of the brush and the official's methodical, unhurried attention to his work. Walking back down the hill with his neighbor, Yoichi listened to the man talk about the lower paddies and the coming rains, and by the time they reached the fork in the lane where their paths diverged, the morning had the feel of a minor practical errand, done and now behind them. Yoichi walked the remaining stretch of lane alone and paused for a moment at his gate. The house before him, the roof still dark with morning damp, the smoke from the kitchen just rising above the eaves. And then he went in. Emmy asked, without urgency, how the registration had gone, and he told her it had been straightforward and there had been no difficulty, and she nodded and returned to the pot on the fire, and that was, in the plainest sense, the end of the matter. But in the days that followed, there was a new quality to certain quiet moments, not visible, not something anyone entering the house would have noticed, only a small additional stillness when Yoichi knelt before the altar to offer incense. A brief interval of awareness directed at nothing one could point to, carried the way warmth is carried in cupped hands. He noticed that Emmy had something similar in the evenings when she set the night's incense. A small pause before striking the fire, a particular quality of attention that had perhaps always been there, and he had only now learned to recognize it for what it was. They did not speak of it directly, which felt right, felt like part of the faithfulness itself. The understanding that some things are preserved not by talking about them, but by the quiet constancy of small daily attention brought to small ordinary acts. The officials moved on to the next district. The village returned to its ordinary rhythms, and the carving remained where it was, resting in the narrow dark behind the altar, still there the new year when the pine ornament went up at the gate, still there in the deep heat of summer, still there when the first rice of the harvest was offered at the altar in the old way. Years later, when Yoichi's son was old enough to sit beside him at the altar and learn the household's observances, Yoichi taught him first the proper gestures for Amida, the way to hold the incense, the correct bow, the small, careful sequence of acts that made up the visible life of the house before the world. And then one evening, when the boy had shown himself over time to be steady and quiet and not given to careless speech, Yoichi brought him to the altar and showed him the gap behind it, and told him what could be told. Only what had been given to Yoichi himself, which was that this had come from far away, from before, and was to be kept and kept and kept. The boy received this with the seriousness of a child who understands, before fully understanding, that something real has been placed in his hands. And so the altar held its double truth, and the seasons moved through the house as they always had, the patties flooding and draining, the neighbors aging, the children of neighbors becoming the neighbors themselves. And in the narrow dark behind the altar, the carved woman rested with her child, patient in the way old wood is patient, which is to say entirely and without complaint. What Yoichi had chosen, on that evening when he sat with Emmy in the lamplight, and spoke carefully about things they had both long known would one day need speaking, was not the bravest thing it is possible to imagine. But it was what was possible within the actual shape of his life, chosen with his eyes open, and in choosing it he had kept, at the cost of the outer form, which could be given back to the world, the one small thing that felt most necessary to carry forward. The altar looked exactly as it had always looked. In the evenings the lamp burned low, and the incense smoke rose and slowly dissolved into the air, and the house filled with the quiet sounds of the night. The fire's small breath, the crickets starting their long autumn work outside, the distant and constant sound of the river finding its way along the valley floor. And behind the altar, in the dark space between the wood and the wall, a woman held a child in carved arms, resting in the particular quiet of something that has been hidden with care, kept not by ceremony, but by the simple sustained act of returning to it, day after day, with the warmth still present in the hands. There was no triumph in any of it, and perhaps no defeat either, only the long and ordinary and specific work of keeping, which is perhaps the most faithful work there is, and the kind least likely to be remembered by anyone who never lived inside that particular house. And that, perhaps, is where Yoichi's evening rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows settling back into stillness, the story folding gently closed like a letter set aside for the night. There is no need to hold on to it. It will keep safe and whole while you rest. Take a slow breath now, if you like. Let your shoulders soften. The room around you is still, the air unhurried. Our next story takes us to the same night unfolding, the same thread of hours, a different door opening with the same unhurried care. There is nothing to do but listen, or simply let the words drift past you, soft as breath. We are in no rush at all. In a small farmhouse near the western edge of a village that had no particular name beyond the one the river gave it, a woman named Yuki sat beside her sleeping daughter and waited for the last lamp to go out. The child, whose name was Mio, was perhaps 7 years old that winter, still young enough to fall asleep without effort, old enough now, just barely, that Yuki had decided tonight was the night. The day had been long and full of proper sorrow, the kind of sorrow that exhausts a person not because it is false, but because it is entirely true. The old rice merchant who lived 3 houses down had died in the night, and the village had gathered in the way that small villages do. The women in dark cotton, the men moving with their shoulders held low, the temple bell ringing through the cold morning air, in intervals so measured they seemed less like sound and more like the feeling of sound, arriving and then dissolving. Yuki had gone to the funeral, as she always went to such things, with full presence, full feeling, full participation in the communal grief that these occasions asked of everyone who had ever exchanged a word with the dead. The old merchant had been a kind man, with a way of pressing an extra measure of rice into a bag without making anything of it, and she had wept for him with complete sincerity in the cold of the temple, her shoulder touching her husband's shoulder, their children kneeling quietly on either side. The monk Daichi had led the Sutras in that steady, unhurried drone that Yuki had heard many hundreds of times across the course of her life, a sound like water moving over stones, low and ceaseless, filling the temple the way warmth fills a room, not announcing itself, but simply present. She had let herself be carried by it, as she always did, because the chanting was genuine and her grief was genuine and the cold stone under her knees was genuine and the smell of incense that clung to the beams, to the sleeves of the mourners, to the very air of that temple, was a smell she had known since she was younger than Mio. None of it was performance. She had long since stopped needing to tell herself that the Buddhist rituals were not a costume worn over something else, but a life she actually lived root deep and daily and unquestioned. And yet, folded small and still inside her through all of it, there had been the other prayer, present the way a held breath is present, not interfering with anything, simply waiting, patient as a seed in dry ground. Her own mother had first described it to her as something that waited, rather than something that needed to be fed or exercised or protected with particular vigilance. The prayer would not leave you, her mother had told her, or rather, her mother had conveyed this not quite in words, but in the particular way she held her own hands after a funeral, loosely, as though releasing something she had been carrying all day and was glad to set down for the evening. This was the texture of the family's knowledge, not spoken aloud, not written, not explained the way a lesson is explained to a child in daylight, but passed from body to body like warmth, or like the way a melody moves between voices in a room. 3 generations of it. By the time Yuki sat in her dark room that winter night, 3 generations of women who had stood in temple courtyards and wept with honest hearts, and then gone home through narrow dirt lanes, and closed their doors and lowered their voices to nothing at all. She thought about this, the 3 generations and the ones before them, and the man who had started it all, the first Yoichi, who was now little more than a name with no face attached to it, and no particular story, only the enormous ordinary fact of what he had once decided. He had decided to hide, and in hiding he had handed something to his children that he could not have fully understood he was handing them. This particular quality of attention, this daily habit of holding 2 things at once without letting either one crowd out the other. She had wondered sometimes whether it had seemed to him a burden or a gift, or whether those categories had simply not applied in the way they applied to her now, sitting in the winter dark with her daughter's hands resting in her lap. The lamp beside the wall had burned down to a low, trembling glow, the kind of light that illuminates nothing specifically, but makes a room feel slightly less empty. A companionable glow, more the memory of light than light itself. Yuki reached over and touched Mio's shoulder very lightly, just enough to bring the child up out of the first layer of sleep without startling her. And Mio opened her eyes in the dark with that particular expression children have when they have been, in some quiet way, half expecting to be woken. Yuki did not speak. She would not speak tonight. Not for this. Not yet. Not here in the dark with the village sleeping around them and the walls of the house as thin as they were. Instead, she took her daughter's small hands in both of her own and held them, palms up and cupped, the way you might hold water if you needed the water not to spill. And then, with no sound at all, she began to move her lips. Mio lay still and watched her mother's face with the calm, unworried curiosity of a child who has learned over 7 years that adults sometimes do things that seem strange at first and sensible only much later. She did not ask what her mother was doing, because something in the quality of the silence, the particular deliberate silence, the kind that felt inhabited rather than simply empty, told her that asking would be wrong, or at least that asking was something for another evening, in another kind of light. Yuki moved through the prayer once, carefully, giving each phrase its full space before moving to the next, her lips tracing the shapes of sounds that had come from very far away and very long ago, and had been worn smooth by all the mouths that had carried them in the dark. There were sounds in the prayer that did not belong to the language of the village, or to any language the village would have recognized, rounded vowels that sat in the mouth like held stones, consonants that softened at their ends in a way that felt almost like a question asked very gently, or almost like a long, slow sigh. Yuki no longer tried to think about where they came from. The sounds had become, for her, simply the sounds of this particular hour of her life, this particular quality of dark, this particular inheritance that had arrived in her hands the way all inheritances do, without being asked for. She moved through the prayer a second time, more slowly, pausing between phrases the way a person pauses while walking a path they know very well. Not because they need to remember the way, but because the pause has become, over time, part of the walk itself. And on the third pass, something changed in Mio's hands, a small softening, a release of some tension the child had not known she was holding. And Yuki saw, in the near darkness, that her daughter's lips had begun to move. Not in time, not accurately. The shapes were approximate, reaching toward the pattern the way a child reaches toward a melody she has only just begun to hear, but they were moving, and that, Yuki knew from everything that had been given to her, was always enough. It had always been enough. She felt something in her own chest that she recognized from the night her mother had done this for her. Not relief, exactly, and not joy, exactly, but something between the two, something that lived in the body rather than in any particular word for it. A kind of continuance, the feeling that the thread had not broken, that the weight had been shifted slightly, distributed now across two sets of shoulders instead of one. She thought about her mother sitting in a room like this one, in another winter many years before, holding her own small hands the same way, and she thought about her grandmother doing the same for her mother, and the grandmother before that. This line of women reaching back into the dark further than she could trace. There had been no instruction, no written doctrine, no teacher who could be consulted, only the dark and the silence and the hands and the lips moving together. What she found remarkable when she allowed herself to think about it was that the prayer had survived it all, that something so fragile, so entirely dependent on the willingness of a single person in each generation to sit in the dark with a child and be patient had not simply been lost the way so many things are lost when they are not written anywhere. A fever in the wrong year, a child born with no patience for silence, a mother who died before the right evening arrived. Any one of these would have been enough, and yet here the prayer was still in her mouth, still reaching toward whatever it had been reaching toward since the beginning. She wondered sometimes whether the prayer she now carried was still the same prayer Yoichi had first folded into the life of the family, whether the sounds had drifted far enough over 3 generations of uncertain hearing and faithful repetition that the original words would have been entirely unrecognizable. She suspected they had, and found, when she held the thought carefully, that she did not mind. The meaning had been the first thing to go, long before Yuki's time, long before her grandmother's time, and what remained was something she believed to be older than meaning and more durable. The pattern, the movement, the breath, the particular softening of the lips on certain sounds. It was a little like the Sutras themselves, she had often thought. The women in the village who chanted alongside Daichi at funerals could not have told you, most of them, what the words meant in any plain-spoken sense, and yet the chanting was real, and the intention behind it was real, and the effect of it, the way it steadied a room, the way it gave grief somewhere to rest, was entirely and undeniably real. She had spent years thinking about whether this made the 2 prayers equivalent, whether carrying a secret prayer alongside the Sutras made her, in some final accounting, disloyal to both, and she had arrived, eventually, at a kind of peace with the question, which was not the same as answering it, but felt, at this point in her life, sufficient. The peace was enough. Mio had fallen back to sleep by the time Yuki finished the 4th pass through the prayer, the child's lips at rest now, her breathing evening out into the slow, absolute rhythm of deep sleep, her hands still held lightly in her mother's. Yuki sat for a while longer without moving, because the dark felt right, and because the weight of everything that had just happened, the funeral, the sutras, the lamp, the teaching, seemed to call for a certain stillness before it could be properly set down. She thought about the fact that tomorrow Mio would wake up and remember very little of this, only that she had been woken in the night, and that her mother's hands had been warm, and that there had been something she would not have a word for yet, something passed between them in the dark. The forgetting did not worry Yuki because the memory that mattered was not the kind that lived in words. It lived further back, in the body, in the muscles of the mouth, and the particular quality of calm that settles into a person who has been carried somewhere very quietly in the night and set down gently. She thought about the old rice merchant, who had been a kind man and was now gone, and about Daichi's voice rolling through the cold temple that morning, and about the way her own weeping had been clean and true, and about the prayer folded small and warm inside her through all of it. She thought about how the two things, the grief for the merchant, the silent prayer beneath the Sutras, had not competed with each other, had not argued, had simply existed alongside each other the way the cold and the dark can both be present in the same room without one of them winning. And she thought, last of all, about the generations ahead of her. The children Mio might have someday, the grandchildren after that, the long, uncertain question of whether this thread she was tending would hold. She could not know, of course, no one ever knows that, and she had long since stopped reaching for certainty about it, had learned to hold the uncertainty the way she held everything else in this life of double prayer, gently, with both hands, without squeezing. The house was very still now, the village outside completely asleep, the winter air pressing softly against the walls with a patience she had always found, in some quiet way, comforting. In the corner of the room, behind the small wooden figure and the incense dish and the wilted flower her eldest had left there 3 days before, the other prayer rested, as it had always rested in this family's keeping, unwritten, unspoken, held only in the warmth of the body, in the movement of lips in darkness, in the hands of one person reaching out to take the hands of another. It asked so little, really, when she thought about it that way. Only to be remembered, only to be given, only to be carried forward one more time, one more generation, one more pair of small and trusting hands learning the shape of something they could not yet name. And there was a kind of faith in that, not the organized, documented, priest-explained kind, but an older kind, the kind that lives in the body before it lives anywhere else, the kind that says simply, I do not know what this means, but I will carry it carefully because someone I love placed it in my hands, and that seems reason enough. Yuki laid down on her own futon in the dark, and the cold settled quietly around her, and above the farmhouse the winter stars were out in their thousands, entirely indifferent and entirely beautiful. Somewhere in the house the old wood shifted and settled, the way wood does in the deep of a cold night, making a sound so small you might have taken it, if you were already half asleep, for someone moving very carefully, or for the exhale of a prayer that no one was saying out loud. And perhaps that is, in the end, where this particular evening rests, in the dark of that small room, the lamp long out, 2 generations breathing quietly side by side, one of them already dreaming and the other almost there, both of them carrying something they would not speak of in daylight and would not lose in the night, moving forward together through the winter into whatever came next. And so we leave that hallway behind, its soft footsteps fading now into the quiet dark where all remembered things go to rest. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let a slow breath move through you, in and out, easy and unhurried, like the tide settling back from shore. The same night is still unfolding, the same still air around us, and the story continues just ahead, patient, waiting for you wherever you are. You need not hold on to anything. Simply let the weight of the evening carry you forward, gently, as one room gives way to the next. In a small village on the western coast of Japan, on a morning in the deep of winter when the lane between the houses lay under a fresh, silent layer of snow, A young woman named Hana woke before the light came and lay still on her futon, listening to nothing in particular. She knew what day it was. She had known for 2 weeks, had known since the headman's boy came down the lane with a folded notice, and each household had received it with a small bow and set it aside without speaking of it, the way you set aside a thing whose meaning everyone already understands. Hana turned on her back and looked up at the low ceiling of her room, the darkness thinning toward gray, the cold settling in the air above the futon and finding the edges of her exposed face and hands. Through the thin wall, she could hear her mother already moving in the kitchen. The soft scrape of the iron pot, the quiet crackle of new wood on last night's embers, and those familiar sounds were somehow both comforting and difficult to hold this particular morning. There was no spoken word between them about what the day would ask, not when Hana rose and dressed in the cold, and not later when she came to the kitchen table and her mother set a bowl of rice in front of her without meeting her eyes. The family had been having this unspoken mourning for 4 generations, and by now it had its own particular shape, its own texture of silence. Not quite grief, not quite stoicism, but something in the country between them. They ate together at the low table while the fire found its warmth, and outside the snow lay white and undisturbed in the lane, and a sparrow crossed the eave of the house opposite and disappeared. Hana's family was, to all appearances, a perfectly ordinary Buddhist household. There was an altar in the corner of the main room with incense burning at the proper hours and a wooden tablet bearing the ancestral names, and Hana's mother bowed before it morning and evening with a sincerity that was entirely genuine. Those gestures had grown into the body over years, real as breathing, as embedded as the sound of the kettle. But tucked behind the altar, in a small space that Hana's grandmother had carefully prepared in the wall some years before, there was a second figure, a woman seated, holding an infant close, her face worn almost smooth by the gentle attention of many hands in the dark over many years. Hana had grown up understanding that this figure carried 2 meanings at once, that she was permitted to love both of them, and that neither could ever be acknowledged outside the walls of this house. Not on a winter morning. Not ever. She pulled on her padded coat and tied the sash and stepped into her straw sandals at the door, and the cold came through the thin soles immediately, the snow in the lane firmer and colder than she had hoped. Other figures were already moving through the village, bundled in their winter layers, walking in the same direction with that particular measured slowness that belongs to people carrying something that cannot be set down. No one spoke more than was necessary. An older woman from the lane behind the temple gave Hana a small nod as she passed, and Hana nodded back. And that was the entirety of their exchange, each of them understanding without needing to name it that this was exactly the correct amount of acknowledgement for this particular morning. The lane wound between the low-eave houses and then opened onto the wider road that led to the village administrative building, a plain wooden structure at the edge of the main quarter with the official crest on its gate and a small brazier burning by the entrance. 2 of the officials' men standing beside it with their hands spread toward the heat. A line had already formed in the open space before the door, perhaps 40 people deep, farmers and their wives, an elderly man leaning on a staff, a woman with a baby bundled against her back who swayed very gently from foot to keep the child warm. Hana took her place at the end of the line and folded her hands inside her sleeves and tried to breathe slowly, the way her mother had taught her, taking the cold air carefully so that it settled in the lungs without seizing them. The line moved in small increments, a few steps at a time, and she watched the people ahead of her disappear through the doorway and emerge again a moment later with their heads down and their faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality. There was something in the way each person came out, not quite guilt, not quite shame, though both may have been nearby, but something more like the composed weariness of someone who has done what was required and has decided that the way to carry it is simply to keep walking. By the time Hana reached the front of the line, her feet were entirely without feeling and the cold had moved up through her legs to settle in her knees, and she was trembling, though whether more from cold or from something else entirely, she could not honestly have said. She stepped through the door into the low, bare room. Two officials sat at a table against the far wall with a register between them, one writing, one watching, both with the unremarkable manner of people performing an ordinary administrative task on an ordinary day, which for them, of course, it was. On the floor in front of the table, set in a plain wooden frame, was the copper plate. It was smaller than she had always imagined, perhaps the length of a man's forearm, worn dark with years of use. The image pressed into its surface in shallow relief. A woman, seated, a child gathered close in her arms. The woman's expression one of such settled, patient quiet that it resembled, if you let yourself look at it for a moment, the look of someone who has been waiting a very long time and has come to a particular understanding about waiting. The man before her in the line stepped forward and placed his foot on the plate without hesitation, the way you step over a threshold you have crossed 100 times, and moved to the table to give his name. He was a neighbor she had known her whole life. A man who grew daikon and barley and sometimes, in autumn, left a few persimmons on the doorsteps of houses where the children were small, asking nothing in return. He was not a Christian and never had been, and so this morning was for him nothing more than a cold inconvenience. And yet even he, turning away from the plate, let out a breath that seemed heavier than the cold room warranted, as though the image, whatever it meant or did not mean to him, had still managed to place something briefly on his chest. Then it was Hana's turn. The official looked up at her briefly, and she walked forward, aware of each thing as it occurred with unusual precision. The texture of the cold floor through her sandal soles, her own quiet breathing, the way her hand had folded themselves together inside her sleeves, as though bracing for something they understood better than she did. She stopped before the copper plate. The face in the image looked up at her from the floor, the woman, the child held close. And Hana held that look for a moment that the clock would have measured in seconds, but that the body measured in something else entirely. And then, because there was no other possible thing to do, because behind her stood a line of her neighbors, and beside her were the officials with their open register, because her family had survived 4 generations by understanding that faithfulness sometimes looks like continuing rather than refusing, she raised her foot and placed it on the plate. The copper was cold, entirely, impersonally cold, and she could feel just barely through the sole of her sandal the faint raised outline of the carved figures beneath her. It lasted no more than a second, that contact, but she felt it with the whole of her attention. She stepped away and went to the table and said her name quietly, and the official wrote it in the register without looking at her, and she bowed and walked out. The brightness outside was sharp after the dimness of the room, the snow reflecting the gray sky with an even, diffuse intensity, and Hana stood for a moment on the threshold adjusting, the cold air moving against her face. The other villagers who had completed their turn were scattered along the road and the lanes beyond, making their way home, their shapes growing smaller in the distance. Hana began to walk. She did not take the direct route home, not by any conscious decision, but simply because when she reached the turning in the lane, her feet continued past it, taking the longer path that wound behind the field along the edge of a stand of Zelkova trees. The kind of path that in summer is pleasant and shaded, and in winter is simply solitary, a road that asks nothing of you except that you keep moving. The snow here was undisturbed, smooth and even, marked only by the thin tracked lines of sparrow feet near the tree roots, and otherwise unblemished, as though the afternoon had agreed to offer her the particular mercy of unbroken ground. Nothing had come this way, yet this morning. Hana walked slowly with her arms folded against her chest, and she listened to the sound of her own footsteps in the snow. The soft compression, the small quiet sound repeated at the rhythm of walking, and she let that sound occupy the space where thought would otherwise have been. And this was, she found, something close to rest. The sky above the fields was the color of old paper, heavy and low, and the snow was still falling in small, unhurried flakes that drifted rather than fell, as though the whole afternoon had agreed to slow down and had communicated this decision to everything within it. She walked until she reached the place where the Zelkova trees curved in close to the path and made a kind of sheltered alcove in the snowfield, where the silence felt slightly more complete than it did in the open. And there she stopped. She looked along the path in both directions, the way you do when what you need to do belongs entirely to yourself, and you want to be certain no one else is present to make it into something other than what it is. The path was empty. The only sound was the falling snow, which is nearly not a sound at all, only a kind of dense, attentive stillness that you notice more in the body than the ears. Hana crouched down slowly, her legs stiff from the long standing in the cold, and put one hand to the snow to steady herself, and when her palm pressed in it left a clear, deep impression, the exact shape of her hand held quietly in the white. She knelt with the snow cold through the cloth at her knee, and she held her right hand just above the surface for a moment, and then she pressed the tip of her index finger to the snow and drew a single line straight down. Then, crossing through it, left to right, careful and deliberate, she drew another. The shape that resulted was small, perhaps the width of her palm, and she had drawn it with the focused attention of someone doing something important, though the gesture itself was plain enough. Though she had made this same shape before in dust and soil, and once in the frost on a window pane on a winter morning very much like this one. But those other times had been ordinary. The quiet, recurring habit of a life lived in the space between two things, and today was different, Today, the crossed lines in the snow carried the weight of the morning in them, held something heavier than lines in snow could reasonably be asked to hold. She stayed crouching over it, looking at what she had made. The snow continued to fall. A single flake landed at the center of the cross and rested there for a moment before dissolving. And another came after it, and another after that, and she watched them accumulate with a patience she had not known she possessed until this particular afternoon. Each flake was so small on its own, each arrival so quiet, and yet there was no ambiguity about what they were doing together. They were slowly and without hurry, filling the line she had made, softening the edges, returning the surface to something smooth and unmarked, the way snow returns everything eventually to its own version of silence. She let them. What moved through her as she watched was not grief in the ordinary sense, not the feeling of something being taken, but something more like the sensation of setting down a weight you've been carrying for a long time, the strange mixed feeling of relief and displacement when your hands are suddenly empty. She found herself thinking about the face and the copper plate, the patient, settled expression of the woman, the child held close in her arms. She had stepped on that face. She didn't flinch from the fact of it, only held it in her attention the way you hold a stone, feeling its weight fully before deciding what to do with it. She had not done this because she had stopped knowing what the face was, or because she had ceased to care about what it represented. She had done it because her family had survived 4 generations by understanding that love, when it runs out of other options, sometimes looks like continuing rather than refusing, like carrying something forward through the dark rather than holding it up in the light and losing it entirely. Her grandmother had not put this into words. The prayer that came down to Hana carried no explanation with it, only the sounds themselves, worn smooth and altered by years of passage through other mouths. Their original meaning dissolved long ago into something more like music than language. But the meaning had traveled in other ways. In the tremble of her grandmother's hands while she whispered the old sounds, in a way she had afterward pressed Hana's hands between her own palms as though passing something carefully from her warmth to Hana's. What had been passed was not a doctrine or a catechism, but something simpler and harder to name. The sense of a mercy that did not require explanation, that did not maintain a careful ledger of cold mornings and forced accommodations, that understood the difference between abandonment and the particular kind of survival that is also, in its way, a form of faithfulness. Hana found herself forming something inside herself that was not quite a prayer in any formal sense because she had no proper language for prayers, only the worn sound she could not translate. It was more like a brief, wordless address directed at whatever listened, amounting roughly to, "I was here, I still know what that face was. Please understand that stepping on it was not the same as having forgotten it." She did not know whether anything received this, or whether the category of receiving even applied to what she was doing in the cold behind the Zelkova trees. That not knowing was something she had lived alongside for her whole life, like a particular piece of furniture in a house that you stop noticing after a while. It was simply there, the space where certainty would have been, and she had learned to inhabit it without distress. The cross was barely visible now. Where the lines had been, the snow was slightly softer, slightly more disturbed than the untouched snow surrounding it, but the shape was losing its definition. In another few minutes, it would be indistinguishable from the ordinary texture of a snowfield on a winter afternoon. Just the ordinary continuous work of weather returning everything to white. She watched it go all the way. She did not shelter it with her sleeve or cover it with her hand. She gave it over to the snow in the same spirit that the snow was receiving it, quietly, without ceremony, with the patient understanding that some things are meant to be held only briefly and then returned, that the holding matters regardless of the returning. When the surface was smooth again and nothing remained to see, she pressed both palms flat to the snow beside the place where the cross had been. Not over it, but near it, the way you might rest your hands close to something that has just departed, a last simple gesture of nearness. Then she rose carefully, pressing one hand to her knee as she straightened, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the trees with the snowfall settling around her. The village was visible over the white curve of the fields, the gray line of rooftops, a thread of smoke rising from a chimney, the dark vertical of a bamboo fence along the main lane. From somewhere in that direction there came, thin and brief, the high voice of a child, a single note of ordinary childhood sound that dissolved into the cold air almost immediately, leaving the silence slightly more noticeable for having been briefly interrupted. Hana turned and began to walk back toward home. Her footprints stretched behind her in the undisturbed snow, the clear record of where she had been, and she was aware, in a distant way, that by evening snowfall they would be covered, and by morning the path would be smooth and unmarked, as though she had not come this way at all. But she had come this way, and the cross had been here, made by her hand with full intention, and the snow had taken it, and all of this had occurred in the quiet middle of an ordinary winter afternoon, witnessed by no one but the bare trees and the falling snow, and none of it required any other witness to have been real. When she reached home, her mother was still in the kitchen. The fire settled now to a steady warmth, and there was the smell of daikon simmering in light broth, that plain and dependable winter smell that fills a small house and makes it feel more inhabited than its walls alone would suggest. Hana removed her sandals and stepped up into the warmth, the cold still present in her hands and feet, her coat hem damp from the snow. Her mother glanced at her once, briefly, a look that held more information than most long conversations, and then returned to the pot without a word. Nothing needed to be said. They both understood where Hana had been and what the morning had asked, and the understanding required no language to be complete. Hana crossed the room and knelt before the small altar, bowing precisely, in exactly the manner that was correct and visible and proper, the kind of bow that would satisfy any observer who happened to glance in through the gap in the shutters. And then, in the quiet of the room, she moved her lips in the worn sounds her grandmother had given her. The old sequence, smooth and altered by years of passage through other mouths, its original meanings long dissolved into something purely carried, transmitted not because anyone understood it, but because it had been transmitted before, and the transmitting was the thing itself. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It came down over the lane and the fields and the path behind the Zelkova trees with the same patient, Impersonal attention it brought to all of it, covering the morning's footprints one by one, filling the depressions, smoothing the surfaces, until everything was even and quiet, as though the ground had decided to offer the world a clean beginning and had no particular opinion about what the day had contained. Somewhere along that path, the last faint trace of a small drawn cross was passing beyond the visible, the two lines losing themselves in the surrounding snow, becoming indistinguishable from the ordinary texture of a winter field, the ordinary continuous work of a cold country, returning everything eventually to white. Hana did not know with certainty what had been communicated that afternoon, or whether communication was even the right way to think about what had passed between her and the cold plate and the cold snow and the falling, patient sky. She knew that she had drawn the mark, and she had watched the snow take it, and that both of these things had felt necessary and right, and that the necessity had nothing to do with what was visible to anyone else or recorded in any register or remembered by any official sitting behind any table in any cold room. She knew that she was still here in this house with this warmth, carrying a set of worn sounds she could not translate but could still feel as weight and continuity and a kind of proof. Something passed to her from hands that had trembled, being passed onward now by hands that trembled still. Her mother set a bowl of soup on the low table without ceremony, warm and plain, and Hana came and sat and put both hands around the bowl and let the heat move back in her fingers in the slow, gradual way that warmth always returns after cold. Not all at once, never all at once, but steadily and with a quiet relief that is none the less real for being small. And that is where we leave her on this particular winter afternoon, at the low table with the soup warm in her hands, the fire steady in the hearth, the snow falling outside the shuttered window as it has fallen on every generation before her, covering the marks as it goes, asking no explanation, making the ground smooth again, leaving the house warm and the evening quiet, and offering, as snow always offers, the simple, unhurried fact of a world that continues. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows settling back into stillness, the way a candle flame steadies after a hand has passed near it. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Let the weight of the night press gently around you. The same story is still unfolding, the same hours moving through that house, and it will be here waiting when you're ready. Our next chapter carries us forward through that same still night, deeper into the hours where the world grows soft and the distances between things feel longer, gentler, easier to rest inside. Her eldest grandchild was kind, deeply and genuinely kind, but Yuki had noticed that she needed to speak her feelings into existence, to turn every private thing into conversation, to share whatever she held with someone else before she could feel she had properly held it. And the thing that needed passing on was not a thing that could live comfortably in that kind of warmth. Her second grandchild was clever in a way that gave Yuki pause. Clever enough that knowing something rare might become, over time, a form of currency he would find difficult not to eventually spend. The third grandchild had a sweetness Yuki did not want to burden, and the youngest two were still too small to bear anything heavier than the day itself. But Rin had something Yuki had seen only a few times in her long life: the ability to sit quietly inside a difficult thing without immediately needing to resolve it, share it, or set it down. She had first noticed it when Ren was 6, the afternoon the old dog died, and instead of weeping as the other children had, Ren had gone very still and sat alone at the edge of the garden for most of the afternoon, simply present with the fact of the loss, not performing it and not suppressing it, just holding it the way you might hold something you're not yet ready to put away. She had seen it again in the spring, when Ren had been scolded for something she had not done, and afterward the child had gone to her corner with open eyes and sat there quietly, not sulking, not crying, just waiting for the feeling to pass the way weather passes, and then return to the evening as though she had set the whole thing down somewhere outside and was not going to carry it indoors. Both times, Yuki had watched from across the room and felt something in her chest settle, like a question that had been waiting a long time, finding its answer without needing to be asked aloud. And so she had come here tonight, in the second hour of the night, in the middle of the quiet rain, to begin the passing on of something that had been in the family for longer than anyone now living could measure in years. She reached out and touched Ren's shoulder very gently, and Ren woke the way she always woke, without alarm or confusion, opening her eyes and looking up at her grandmother in the low, warm light with the calm and immediate presence of someone who had learned early that when Yuki came to her in the night, there was nothing to be afraid of. Yuki whispered to her to sit up, and Rin did, drawing the quilt around her shoulders against the cold of the room, her dark eyes moving quietly between the lantern and her grandmother's face. Yuki lowered herself onto the tatami beside her granddaughter, her old knees complaining softly as she settled, as she took Ren's small hands in both of her own and held them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The lantern gave its low, patient light. The rain moved steadily across the thatch above. The village outside was entirely dark. Then Yuki began. What came from the old woman's lips was not the everyday language Ren knew, not the words of the household and the fields and the schoolroom, but something older and stranger, a sequence of sounds that arranged themselves in ways Ren had no map for, rising and falling in patterns unlike the sutras she had heard at the temple, unlike the counting rhymes of childhood, unlike anything she could find a comparison for. There were round sounds and old sounds, and they move in the mouth differently for Japanese, curving where Japanese was precise, opening where Japanese tended to close, with vowels that hung in the air a moment longer than felt natural, and consonants that moved past them without urgency, the whole stream flowing at a pace that Ren's ear could not quite follow and could not quite let go of. Yuki's voice was barely above a breath, so low that if you had been standing outside the door you would not have heard it, so low that Ren had to lean slightly forward to receive it fully. And the sound arrived less like language than like something else, more like warmth and volume, filling the small lamplit space between them without reaching past the edges of it. There was a pulse in the sounds, a rhythm her body recognized before her mind did, not the rhythm of music exactly, but something beneath music, something more like the rhythm of breath itself, of a heartbeat, of the rain moving in long, slow passes across the thatch above. Peyton listened. She listened with the whole of her attention, not reaching for meaning. She understood quickly that there was no meaning to reach for, that these were not words in the way that other words were words, but holding the shape of the sounds the way you hold something handed to you in the dark before you have seen what it is, with both hands and careful attention. She found herself thinking that the sounds were like water moving over stones in a river she had never visited. Not the sound of the water itself, but the particular sound of water shaped by something beneath it that she could not see. She thought without knowing quite how she thought it. These sounds have been somewhere before this room. They have traveled a long way to arrive here tonight. And then she became aware of her grandmother's hands. They had been there from the beginning, those familiar hands, large-knuckled and warm, the skin thinner than it had been when Run was very small and would reach up for them on the path to the market. The working hands of a woman who had spent 70 years being useful. But in the first minutes, Run had been so given over to the sounds that she had forgotten her own hands were held, had forgotten the physical fact of them entirely. Now she remembered, and with the remembering came an awareness that Yuki's hands were trembling. It was not the trembling of cold, though the room was cold enough that Run could see her own breath in the lantern light. And it was not the trembling of age alone, though Yuki's hands did sometimes shake in the mornings over the first cup of tea. This trembling came from deeper in the body, or from somewhere outside the body entirely, and it moved not in the quick, meaningless vibration of cold muscles, but slowly, steadily, the way a plucked string vibrates, deliberately, carrying something in it, something that had been set in motion long before tonight and had not finished resonating. Rin felt it move from her grandmother's palms into her own, up through her wrists, settling somewhere in the center of her chest in a low, serious note that she had no word for but recognized as important. She looked at her grandmother's face. The sounds were still coming, steady and unhurried, but the face above them wore something it did not usually wear, a composed and gathered stillness, like the look of a person carrying a full vessel across an uneven floor, all of their attention drawn inward around the task of not spilling it. The eyes were open, but they were not looking at Ron. They were looking somewhere past the paper screen and the wet thatch, and perhaps past the night itself, towards something Rin could not locate and understood in some wordless way that she was not yet supposed to find. The sounds continued, steady and soft. The hands continued to tremble. And in that moment, without a word of explanation, without any preparation at all, Rin understood something. Not what the sounds meant. She would never fully know that, and neither had anyone who had carried them before her. Not where they came from, not who had first spoken them, or under what roof, or in what century, or what danger had first required that they be kept so small and so quiet. She understood something simpler than any of that, and more difficult. The trembling was the message. The trembling was the honest bodily truth of what the words could not say. The evidence of how long this had been carried, how much it weighed, how real it was, this thing she was being given in a cold room by lamplight by an old woman who loved her and was afraid of losing it before it could be passed on. The sounds came to their end without drama. The last syllable dissolving into the ordinary quiet of the room the way a river dissolves into the sea, without ceremony, simply arriving at where it was always going. Yuki sat still for a long time, her eyes slow in returning to Ren's face, and when they did, the gathered stillness softened and released, and she became again the grandmother, the morning kitchen woman, the fire-tending woman, the woman of braided hair and muddy floors, and the evening meal. She pressed Ren's hands once, gently, and Ren felt the trembling still faintly present, fading now, like warmth leaving a stone after the sun has moved away. Ren asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, what the words meant. Yuki was quiet for a moment before she answered, not hesitating, just giving the question the space it deserved. And then she told her quietly that she had never known, and that her own grandmother had not known either, and that the knowing had gone out of the sound a very long time ago, passed through too many careful whispers and too many cold rooms, worn smooth like the stones in the path outside the door. Ren sat with this, turning it over, not distressed by it, simply receiving it. She asked what the sounds were for, then if not for meaning. Yuki considered this for a long moment, and then described it as the warmth that stays in a cup after the tea has been drunk. The tea is gone. You cannot taste it. You cannot swallow the warmth itself, but it is still real and still there, and you can hold your hand around it in the cold, and it is still something. She told her that what lived in the sounds now was not meaning but presence. The presence of everyone who had said them before, all the people Run would never meet and could not name, all the way back to a first person, an ancestor named Yoichi, who had made the decision to keep this thing alive in a time when keeping alive required more courage than either of them could properly imagine. She told her that saying the sounds was a way of not losing those people entirely, of keeping a thread between now and then, however worn, however thin, however far it had traveled from what it had originally been. Ren listened to this with her full attention and let the parts she didn't entirely understand settle inside her in the way a child learns to let things settle. Knowing they will be comprehensible later, trusting the later the way you trust a room that is dark at the moment, but known to be there. She asked one more question very softly. Why her, of all the grandchildren? And Yuki told her what she had been watching, and how long she had been watching it, and that she had seen in Ren something she trusted more than cleverness, more than diligence, more than any of the qualities the world usually praised. She told her she had seen the ability to hold a heavy thing without needing to immediately put it down, and that was the only quality that truly mattered for this. They sat together for a while after that. In the last of the lantern light, the old woman and the child, and outside the autumn rain continued its quiet work on the thatch and the garden and the stones in the path, unconcerned and steady. Rin became aware, at some point in that stillness, that the trembling in her grandmother's hands had stopped. She looked down at them, those familiar large-knuckled hands, now resting quiet in her own, and she pressed them softly, the way you press something you want to stay, and Yuki's hands pressed back, warm and still. Over the weeks that followed, Yuki came to her in the same way, on still nights, late when the household was sleeping, and brought the sounds in small portions, a few syllables at a time, repeated softly until Run could hold them and offer them back, shakily at first, then with a little more ease, though never with anything like fluency, because fluency had never been the goal and neither of them pretended that it was. The goal was simply to have the sounds exist in one more living person, to extend by one more generation the thread that had been passed along through careful, frightened, devoted people, losing a little of the original form each time, but not losing ever the warmth. Sometimes during those winter sessions, Run would watch her grandmother's hands and see them tremble when a particular passage arrived. Yuki would mention later, quietly, that passage had always been difficult, that it had always trembled, and Rin found herself wondering if the difficulty itself was inherited, if the hardness had traveled forward with the sounds the way the sounds traveled forward, generation by generation, the imperfections and the effort arriving intact alongside, the thing being carried. She found this, somehow, a comfort. It meant the people before her had not been fearless, had not been perfect, had not moved through the keeping of this secret without struggle, but had held it imperfectly and passed it on anyway. And the passing on was the point, and had always been the point, and no amount of imperfection in the holding diminished that. Toward the end of winter, on one of those late nights when the lantern was burning low and both of them were tired in a contented way, Rin told her grandmother what she had come to feel about the trembling, that it seemed to her like the one honest place in the whole secret, the place where the weight of it showed through and could not be hidden, the moment where everything that had been kept invisible for so many years surfaced briefly in a body and became visible. Yuki looked at her for a long moment and then said simply that yes, Rin had understood it correctly and that she was glad. By the time the cold broke and the first warmth of new spring returned to the mornings, Rin could say the whole sequence from beginning to end, shakily, quietly, barely above a whisper, and the sounds lived in her now the way they had lived in Yuki, in a place below language and below ordinary memory, in the body's own deep storage where certain things are kept because the mind alone is not strong enough to carry them. She did not always understand what she was holding. She had been told that this was fine, that it had always been fine, that the not understanding was simply the shape the gift took after so many years and so many hands. And outside the farmhouse, through those long winter nights and into the returning spring, the world went on as it always had, entirely unaware that in a small room by a single lantern, two pairs of hands, one old and trembling, one young and still, had held between them something for centuries old, keeping it alive in the only way it had ever known how to stay alive. Quietly, in the dark, passed from the warmth of one body to another. That is where this part of the story rests tonight, in the trembling and in the child who felt it, and in the stillness that came after when both of them sat together with the rain on the roof and the lantern burning low, and the sound settled somewhere safe inside a new and trusted pair of hands. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows soften and dissolve quietly into the dark behind you. There is no rush at all. If you need a moment, take it now, breathe in slowly, and let the breath out just as gently, all the way down. You're still here, still safe, still held in the soft weight of rest. Our next story takes us forward along the same path, the same story continuing, the same night unfolding, the same stillness deepening all around. All you need to do is stay exactly as you are and let the voice carry you a little further into sleep. Somewhere beyond the last familiar road, in a small farmhouse at the edge of a village where the fields grew dark by early evening and the mountains held all the sound of wind, an old man named Kenji sat alone beside a lamp that had burned very low, waiting for the house to settle into silence. It was not merely quiet that he was waiting for, the kind of quiet that falls naturally when the day has tired itself out and the children have been sent to their sleeping mats, but the deeper stillness that comes only when every breath in every room has found its slow nighttime rhythm, when the house itself seems to have released something it had been holding. He had learned to wait for this the way all the men and women in his family had learned to wait for it, generation after generation, this careful listening at the edge of the night before the real work began. Across the low table from him, sitting with her legs folded beneath her and her hands very still in her lap, was his granddaughter now, 8 years old, who had been told only that tonight was a night when she needed to stay awake a little longer than usual, and who had asked no further questions because she was the kind of child who understood when not asking was the right thing to do. He had been watching her for 2 years before tonight, in a quiet way that the family had always watched its children, not for cleverness, not for piety, not for any quality that could be named and praised aloud in ordinary conversation, but for a particular kind of stillness that lived in certain people from the very beginning, a capacity for holding something without letting it show. She had it, that stillness. He had seen it in the way she sat through long temple visits without fidgeting, in the way she listened to conversations between adults without any visible impatience for them to end, in the way she kept small household secrets, the mild kind that children are tested with before they are trusted with anything more, with a reliability that was, at her age, quietly remarkable. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on the edge of the table, the way he had seen his own father lean forward on the night he was taught, and he told her softly that what he was about to give her was older than anything she could imagine being old. He told her it was older than the temple down the road, older than the mountain behind the village, older than anything she would ever be able to speak of to most people, because this was not a thing that could be shared freely. Not now. Not yet. And perhaps not for a very long time. He watched her face for alarm and found none, only that even, attending steadiness she had always carried, looking back at him from across the lamp. And so he began. The first thing he said was that the words were not Japanese and that she would not understand them, and that he could not explain what they meant because he did not know himself, and that not knowing was all right, was, in fact, the condition in which every person in the family had carried them for more generations than he could count. She seemed to consider this for a moment, the way she considered most things, seriously, without drama, and then accepted it with a small nod, and he was grateful for it, grateful that she was not the kind of child who needed a thing to make sense before she could hold it. He formed the first sounds very carefully, giving each one its full shape, speaking at a volume so low it barely qualified as speech, more like breath that had been given a slight additional precision, a direction, and he watched her watching his lips, reading the movements the way he had once read his own father's, trying to memorize not just the sound but the place in the mouth where each sound was made. He had told her beforehand to do exactly this, to watch as much as to listen, because some of these sounds were not sounds that a Japanese mouth made in ordinary life, and knowing where to rest the tongue and how to hold the breath was as much a part of learning them as anything else. The opening passage moved through him and into the air between them, and he felt, as he always felt at this moment, a sensation he had never quite been able to name. Not warmth exactly, not weight exactly, but something in between, as if the sounds themselves carried a small residue of all the times they had been spoken before, all the mouths and dark rooms, and careful years folded into each syllable, released slightly as the syllable left the mouth. His father had felt it too, he knew, because his father had mentioned it once. In the quiet way his father said most things, noting that the words felt like company, and Kenji had understood immediately, had not needed any further explanation, had simply carried that description with him for 40 years as the most accurate account of the experience he had ever encountered. The opening passage came and went, and then the second, and then he arrived at the middle section. The middle section had always sat differently in him than the rest of the prayer. Not badly, not with any sharp sense of wrongness, but with a quality of slightly less certainty, the way a path, well has one particular stretch where the footing is less reliable, where the body slows down without quite deciding to, where something just beneath conscious attention registers that this is the part that requires a little more care. He had rehearsed the middle section many times over the years, in the manner of someone rehearsing something they're quietly afraid of losing, going over each syllable in the late hours, testing the sounds against his memory of his father's voice, confirming they were where he had left them, that nothing had faded or shifted in the way that things sometimes fade and shift in a person's memory when life gets busy and years pile up. But there was one passage, a few lines into the middle section, where something had always given him pause. Not enough to stop, not enough to feel like an actual mistake, only enough to make him, for the length of one slow breath, uncertain. The distinction was small. A single syllable in the middle of a line, a sound that could reasonably have been one of two near neighbors, two sounds so close to each other in the way the mouth made them that in ordinary conversation you might never notice the difference between them. But in the silence of this room, at this hour, with a child watching carefully and waiting to memorize each movement of his lips, the difference between those two sounds felt, briefly, significant. He had received the sound as his father gave it to him, and he had kept it as he had received it, and his father had received it from his father, and his father from his, stretching back through the generations all the way to the beginning of the hiding, to the time of Yoichi, the quiet farmer who had decided to live in two worlds at once, who had pressed his hands together in one way in public, in a different way in private, and carried both prayers forward without complaint. Back to that beginning, this sound had traveled, mouth to mouth, crossing seasons and harvests and the ordinary turbulence of family life, carried forward through everything, and somewhere in that long crossing it was possible, quietly, simply possible, that it had changed. not through carelessness, and not through any decision anyone had consciously made. Only through the ordinary fallibility of human hearing, the way any sound reproduced many times by many mouths in many different conditions will drift imperceptibly from wherever it began, the way the game children play in which a message is whispered around a circle will always arrive at the end changed. Not because anyone cheated, but because the channel between one ear and another is not a perfect system. And perfection was never what the channel was built for. His father had passed him a sound. His father's father had passed his father a sound. And at some point in the chain, in some room, in some long ago winter, some grandfather, a man whose name was now unknown, whose face had never been drawn or described anywhere, who existed now only as a presence implied by the very fact that the family was still here, had listened to the sound he was given and stored it faithfully in the place where such things are stored, and later, in his own late-night teaching, had reproduced it exactly as he remembered it, which was perhaps not quite, exactly as it had come to him. Kenji held the syllable for a moment in the space before speaking it, feeling its slight weight of uncertainty, the very familiar pressure of not knowing. And then he let it go the way he always let it go, the way he had learned to let it go over 40 years of carrying it, as his father had given it, no more and no less. He said it clearly and steadily, with the same unhurried care he had brought to every sound before it, and let it pass from his lips into the space between them, and from there, he hoped, into the careful and receiving attention of the girl sitting across the lamp. She was watching him the way he had hoped she would watch, not with visible strain, not with the tight concentration that makes a child look frightened, but with that relaxed and total presence he had noticed in her from the beginning, the quality of being simply and entirely there. He moved through the rest of the middle section with the steady patience of someone mending something by feel and poor light, attentive to each small stitch, not hurrying because there was no reason to hurry and no place to be except right here, in this room, at this lamp, giving this child what she had been chosen to receive. And then came the final passage, which arrived more easily than the middle ever had, which had always arrived more easily, opening in him the way a familiar road opens when you have been traveling long and the landscape begins to show signs you recognize. He slowed slightly in the last few lines, giving the final syllables more room, the way his father had given them room, drawing the ending out a little so that the last sounds could land with their proper weight, because the ending was where the prayer chose to become quiet, where something in the movement of it opened outward and then simply stopped, and the stopping mattered as much as anything that came before it. And then it was over. They sat in the silence together, the lamp between them, the house breathing its slow night breath around them. And there was in that silence a particular fullness that Kenji had come to associate with this moment. This specific few minutes after the teaching ended, and before the ordinary world resumed its claim on the room, when the air still held the shape of what had just passed through it. He asked her softly whether she thought she had it. She was quiet for a moment before answering. In the careful way, she was always quiet before most answers, and then she whispered that she thought so, mostly, and that there was one part in the middle she wanted to go over again in her mind. He told her that was exactly the right thing to say, that the middle was always where the words sat less securely, in him too, and in everyone who had carried this before them, as far back as he knew. She asked very quietly whether the words had always been uncertain in that part, and he said that yes, he believed so, and that he had made his peace with it a long time ago, and that she would likely make her peace with it too, in time. What he did not say, what lived in the private part of himself, the part that had sat alone with these words for 4 decades and had, over time, arrived at a kind of understanding about them, was the thing he had come to believe about the uncertainty itself. Because what had been passed to him was not a perfect record, not a clean and exact copy made by careful hands from a definitive original. It was something that had been kept alive in the hardest of ways, by ordinary people in ordinary rooms under ordinary pressure, who had done what they could with what they had, who had listened as carefully as human listening allows, who had given forward what they had received and trusted that receiving it, however imperfectly, was better than nothing. The continuity was the thing. The priest who might have corrected the syllable had been gone from this region for more generations than Kenji could count. Gone so thoroughly that even the story of his departure was lost. Even the name of the last one who had stood in a room and said these words from an actual book was forgotten, swallowed by the same silence that had closed over everything connected to this faith in this corner of the country for 100 years or more. Without him, the family had no standard to return to, no authority to appeal to, no way to know what the words were supposed to sound like when they were exactly right. They had only each other, the living and the dead, the mouths that had spoken and the ears that had listened, and the small variations that had entered and settled in over the generations the way a river settles slightly into a new course. Not through anyone's intention, not through any failure of care, simply through time, and the way time works on everything it touches. He told now to say the uncertain passage quietly to herself as she was falling asleep, not straining to pin it down, not trying to decide whether she had it right, only letting the syllables move through her the way a tune moves through you after you have heard it, finding the place where such things go without any effort on your part. She nodded and unfolded herself from the mat and padded out of the room in the quiet way she always moved, as if she had already understood without being told that the house at this hour did not welcome unnecessary sound. He stayed alone in the dimming light for a while, the lamp burning lower now, and he turned the uncertain syllable over in his mind one more time. The way you turn a stone in your hand without expecting to find anything new on its underside, simply because the turning has become its own kind of habit, its own small ceremony. Was it the right sound, the one he had given her? He held the question for the length of a single slow breath, and then let it settle into the floor the way such questions eventually settle, when you have carried them long enough to understand that they are not the kind of questions that get answered. There was no one to confirm it, and no book to check, and no road that led back to certainty. And the question would remain the way it had remained for as long as the family had been hiding. And that was the shape of it. And arguing with the shape of what you had was its own kind of loss. He thought about the grandfather somewhere back in the chain. The specific unnamed man who had first made this sound the way it now was, who had sat in his own room in his own dark and listened to his own father's lips with every intention of getting it exactly right, and who had then carried what he had heard for 30 years, and then sat across a lamp much like this one, and passed it forward with everything he had, giving what he had heard, which was perhaps already a little different from what had been given to him. And the family had received it, whatever it was, and held it and passed it forward, because the alternative was to let it end. And letting it end was the one thing that felt across all the generations and all the uncertainty simply impossible, not heroic, not principled in any grand sense, only impossible in the way that setting down something you have carried for your whole life is impossible. Because by that point, you no longer know how to walk without the weight of it. He rested his hand briefly on the base of the small carved figure on the low shelf, the graceful cannon face looking down with that ancient and particular gentleness, the small child figure resting in the crook of its arm, which to any passing visitor meant one thing, and to this family had always quietly meant another. And then he lowered the wick until the flame was gone. In the room where now was sleeping, the words he had given her were already doing what newly given things do, becoming less like something external, something received from outside, and more like something that had always been there, the way a sound you have heard many times becomes simply part of the texture of the world. The syllable he had passed forward without certainty, the one that had paused him for the length of a breath before he said it, was in there with the rest of them now, indistinguishable from the sounds on either side of it, as much a part of the prayer as any other piece. If it was wrong in the same way it had perhaps been wrong for 100 years, wrong in the way that a river is wrong about where it is when it has quietly shifted from its old bed into a new one. Not wrong exactly, but simply changed, and having changed now, simply what it was. The words would go forward from now the way they had gone forward from every person in the line before her, imperfectly and faithfully at once, which is perhaps the only way that anything truly important has ever passed between people across very long distances of time. And whatever those words had once been, those original sounds that the first priest had given to the first family in whatever room, in whatever season, so far back it had no texture left, they were by now also this. Also what the family had made of them through the long insistence of their keeping. Also the particular form that a particular grandfather's particular ear had heard on a particular night and stored and reproduced and given forward. Also that. And Kenji, alone in the dark room, thought that this was all right, thought that the person who had first brought these words across the sea to this small corner of the country would perhaps not have found it wrong if they had known that the sounds had changed and that the changing had happened in the most human way possible, carried in chests and passed by lips and kept alive through a silence that was never empty, because it was always full of people trying, always full of a family doing. The ordinary impossible thing that families do across the long dark, which is to hold out their hands toward the next generation and give them what they have. The night ended the way such nights had always ended in this house, and in the house before this house, and in the house before that, with a lamp going dark and a room growing very still, and somewhere nearby a child sleeping with new syllables resting in her, slightly worn from the long journey they had made to reach her, and entirely, quietly sacred. And that perhaps is where we might let this particular evening rest. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows settle into stillness, like dust returning gently to the floor. You may rest here for a moment. There is no hurry, no need to hold anything tightly. Let your breath come slow and easy. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting now. The night is not finished with us yet. The same story continues, the same quiet hours unfolding around a different room, different voices, the same soft current of time moving through. Simply listen or simply drift. Either way, the story will find you, carrying you a little further into the dark, a little closer to sleep. In a small house at the end of the lane that ran alongside the temple wall, a woman named Hana sat alone in the lamplight, her knees folded beneath her on the old tatami, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She was 6 generations removed from a man she had never known, a man named Yoichi, and she was about to do the thing her grandmother had taught her, which was to move her lips without making any sound. Outside, the rain had begun, not urgently, not with any particular announcement, but slowly, the way rain sometimes arrives in autumn as though it has simply forgotten to stop. She could hear the temple on the other side of the wall, the evening bell still settling into silence, its last low resonance moving through the wood of the house the way warmth moves through a closed room long after the fire has been banked. Hana waited for the bell's echo to fully disappear before she began, because that was what her grandmother Yuki had always done, and Yuki had learned it from her own grandmother, who had learned it from someone else entirely, in a time that none of them could now quite reach. Pause. When the silence was complete enough, she let her lips begin to move. The words, if they could still be called words, came out in the way that very old things come out of a person. Not from memory exactly, but from somewhere lower than memory, somewhere in the chest, in the throat, in the careful management of breath. She breathed in before each phrase the way the monks breathed in before each line of a sutra, with that particular measured inhale that is not quite a sigh and not quite preparation, but something in between the two. And the phrases themselves rose and fell the way sutra phrases rise and fall. A high note somewhere in the middle of each line, a softening at the end, the last syllable trailing away into a breath rather than a stop. If you had been standing in the lane outside and listened carefully through the rain, you would not have been able to say with any certainty what it was that the woman inside was doing. Pause. You might have guessed that she was reading from the temple's texts, or that she was reciting something learned in childhood and not quite remembered, the way one recites a poem long after the original occasion for learning it has passed. What you would not have guessed, what no one passing the house in the 6th generation of its keeping had ever guessed, was that what she was saying had traveled to this small room from somewhere very far away, across water and centuries in a silence so long it had become its own kind of sound. The words were Latin, or had been Latin once, in the 1st generation, when a man named Yoichi had written them down phonetically in the syllables available to him, because the sound of them was all he had left after the priest had gone. By the 2nd generation, they were already slightly altered, a consonant here, a vowel there, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary drift of sound through an imperfect ear passing to another imperfect ear. By the third generation, the alterations had compounded, and the phrases were beginning to lose the particular quality of a foreign language. That slight friction of a tongue forming shapes it was not born to form. By the fourth, they sounded already quite Japanese, and a scholar of Latin, hearing them, would have had to listen very hard indeed to find the original beneath the surface. Pause. By the fifth, by the time Yuki had whispered them into the ear of the child who would become Hana's mother, the Latin had settled entirely into the rhythms of the language around it, like water finding the shape of whatever holds it. And by the sixth, by this night, by this rain, by these lips moving in the lamplight, the thing Hana was saying was in cadence and in feeling almost perfectly indistinguishable from what was being recited at that very moment by the monks on the other side of the wall. Hana had realized this herself some years before, on a night when the temple had left its doors open and the evening recitation had spilled out into the lane, and she had found herself pausing mid-breath because she could not, for one strange moment, tell which sound was which. Her own lips had stopped moving, and she had listened to the monks, to the rain, to the faint echo of what she had just been saying, and felt something that she could not quite name, which was not quite unease and not quite wonder, but somewhere between the two, the way important things often live. She had thought of her grandmother Yuki, who had taught her to make this sound, and of Yuki's hands, which had always trembled a little when she whispered it, a tremor that Hana had assumed was age, though now she sometimes thought it might have been something else, something more like the physical expression of the weight the words carried even without their meaning. She had wondered whether Yuki had known, had wondered whether any of the generations between herself and Yoichi had known that the thing they were preserving had slowly, over many lifetimes, taken on the clothes of the very tradition they had been hiding within. It was, she had finally decided, either very funny or very profound, and on that evening she had quietly concluded that it was probably both. Pause. What Hana could not know, sitting in her lamp-warmed room, was the specific shape of what had been lost, the names of the particular prayers, the liturgical occasions they belonged to, the images they were meant to call to mind. She did not know that one phrase, which she recited in a smooth, descending tone that ended with a sound like water being poured into a shallow bowl, had once been spoken while kneeling on stone floors in a cold building very far from this island, in the early morning before the rest of the city was awake. She did not know that another phrase, the longer one, the one that Yuki had always paused before, taking a slow breath as though it required slightly more of her than the others, had once been a petition, a request addressed to a specific presence, asking for something very particular that the asker had been afraid to ask aloud in any ordinary way. None of this had survived the crossing of generations, the narrowing of transmission to a single thread at a time, the long unwriting of a language that had never been written down in a form anyone in the family could read. Pause. What had survived was the sound, and the breathing, and the slight ceremony of waiting for quiet before beginning, and the particular weight of the thing, the sense, carried without explanation from mother to child to grandchild and further still, that this was not casual, that this mattered in a way that did not require justification. That weight, Hana thought, was perhaps its own kind of meaning. She paused at the longer phrase, the petition, though she did not know it was a petition, and breathed in before it the way Yuki had breathed in before it, and felt the old familiar expansion in her chest, the same feeling she had every time, which she had long ago stopped trying to name and had simply allowed to be there. Breath. The lamp on the shelf cast its light across the small carved figure in the alcove, the one that had been in this house for as long as anyone in the family could remember, the one that looked to most eyes exactly like the seated canon you might find in any household, the merciful bodhisattva with the soft face and the child held gently at the chest. Yuki had told her what the figure meant to their family, had told her late at night, with the manner of someone entrusting something fragile, and Hana had received the information with the careful stillness she had been taught to apply to fragile things. She looked at the figure now, as she recited, as she always did, and found, as she always found, that the face was simply a kind face, and that kindness, whatever name it operated under, was consistent. Pause. In her mind, as she moved through the phrases, Hana sometimes tried to imagine Yoichi. The first one, the ancestor she would never meet, the man who had decided, in a village somewhere in the western provinces in a time of great fear, to keep this thing alive by hiding it so carefully that the hiding itself became the tradition. She had almost no information about him, only what Yuki had passed on. That he had been a farmer, that he had been afraid, that he had done what frightened people do when they love something. He had hidden it, and hoped and trusted that the future would find it. She tried to imagine his voice, the actual sound of it, the way it had sounded when he first learned the prayers from a priest who would eventually be forced to leave, when the words still had their original shapes and the cadences were still something strange and foreign to a Japanese ear. She imagined it as a careful voice, not scholarly, not musical particularly, but attentive, the voice of someone learning something he understood to be important and was afraid of forgetting. And she thought of the long journey those sounds had taken from his throat to hers, passing through 6 other lives, 6 other throats, each slightly altering what it received, each adding without knowing something of their own intonation, their own breath, their own particular way of moving sound through the body on a cold night with the lamp burning low. Pause. What arrived in her was not what Yoichi had sent. She knew that, and accepted it without any particular grief. And yet what arrived in her still felt, somehow, inhabited. Inhabited was the word she would have used if anyone had asked her, which no one ever did, because no one outside this house knew this was happening. It felt as though the sound still contained him, not as information, not as meaning, but as a kind of warmth in the material, the way a stone holds heat from a sun that set hours ago, and you press your hand to it in the dark and are surprised to find it still warm, still giving back what was given to it. The monks on the other side of the wall continued their evening recitation, and Hana continued hers, and in the lane between them the rain came down steadily and unhurried, neither side aware of the other, both engaged in the same ancient human activity, which is to speak words whose full meaning you may not entirely understand in the direction of something you cannot quite see. There is a particular phrase she was coming to now. Near the end of the recitation, in the part that Yuki had always said was the most important, though she had not been able to say why, only that this was what had been told to her. The phrase was shorter than the others, and it had the shape of an ending, a slight gathering of the breath, a last small rise, and then a soft descent that left the room quieter than it had been before. Hana recited it now, lips moving without sound, and felt the familiar ending shape of it pass through her, the small gathering and the descent, and then the quiet that followed. Pause. She sat with the quiet for a moment, as Yuki had always sat with it, as all of them had sat with it in their turns. Not because they had been instructed to, but because the quiet at the end of the recitation had always felt as though it needed to be honored, the way you might sit for a moment after setting down something that has been heavy to carry. Outside, the rain was easing into something lighter, barely more than mist now, and the temple bell had been silent for some time, and the lane was very still. Hana looked at the small carved figure in the lamplight and wondered, as she sometimes did, whether Yoichi would recognize what she had just done as the thing he had first done all those generations and all those alterations ago. She thought probably he would not the specific words, not the rhythm, not the cadence that had by now become entirely Japanese in its feeling and its form. And yet she thought that perhaps he would recognize something else, which was harder to name. The quality of the silence before and after, the care with which the breath was taken, the slight settling weight in the chest that lingered when the recitation was complete. Pause. These things, she thought, had perhaps traveled intact even as everything else had shifted. The way certain emotions are recognizable across centuries in a painted face, even when everything else about the painting has faded beyond easy reading. The meaning had been lost. She accepted this fully, without grief particularly, only with the kind of quiet acknowledgement one gives to things that are simply true. Meanings are fragile, and words are fragile, and the conditions required for a language to survive intact across 6 generations in secret pass from a single person to a single person each time, with no correction and no confirmation available. Those conditions, she thought, were perhaps not conditions under which meaning could be expected to survive. But something had survived, and she was certain of it. And she was certain of it not because it could be explained, but because she felt it in the warmth in her chest after the recitation, in the way the room felt slightly different after she had done this than it had felt before. She placed her hands back in her lap and let her eyes rest on the lamp. Pause. The lamp burned steadily, the flame barely moving in the still air of the room, and she watched it for a while without thinking about anything in particular, which was, she had found over the years, the best state to be in after the recitation, the one that felt most like an appropriate ending. It was in this state, sitting in the lamplight with the rain nearly stopped outside and the temple quiet, that she sometimes felt something she could only describe as company, a sense of the room being occupied by more than just herself, not threateningly so, not with any quality of strangeness, just company, the gentle sense of not being entirely alone in the particular way that one can be alone in a quiet room late in the evening. She had once tried to describe this to her mother, who had nodded slowly and said, with the particular tone she used for things she found difficult to put into words, that yes, she felt it too, that it had always been so. Pause. Neither of them had said the name of who or what the company might be, because it was the kind of thing that resisted naming, that seemed to become smaller or stranger the moment you try to put a word to it. It was simply there, and it was simply kind, and that across the years and the generations had been enough. Hana sat in the lamplight and the company for a while longer, the way one sits in the warmth of a room one is about to leave, wanting to carry a little of it away into the rest of the night. She thought of Yuki's hands again, her grandmother's hands with their slight tremor when the recitation began, and thought of all the hands before Yuki's, all the way back to the hands that had first held the prayers when the prayers were still new and fully understood. She thought of the faces she had never seen. Yoichi in his village in the early years of the hiding, the wife he had consulted before deciding to hide at all, the daughters and sons and grandchildren who had received this sound and passed it on, each one having a night like this, a lamp like this, a room going quiet at the end, and then the particular stillness afterward. Pause. She was not the last, she hoped. She had a daughter of her own, still quite young, who did not yet know about the recitation, who slept at this moment in the room next door breathing the slow breath of children, unaware that moving through her life was a thread that had already passed through many lives before hers. There would be a night, not yet. She would choose carefully, as all of them had chosen carefully, when she would take her daughter's hand and the whisper would begin again. And her daughter would receive it as Hana had received it, as Yuki had received it, as all of them in their turns had received it, not with comprehension of what the words meant, but with the older comprehension that sometimes passes between a hand and the hand it holds. Breath. The flame in the lamp bent briefly, for no clear reason, and then straightened itself. Hana watched it straighten and thought of nothing for a moment, which was a kind of completion in itself. Outside, what remained of the rain was barely a sound anymore, more like the memory of rain than rain itself, the faint percussion of the last drops settling on the roof tiles, easing slowly toward morning. Pause. The monks had gone inside for the night, their sounds drawn back behind the temple walls, and the lane was as quiet as a lane can be when the world has been washed clean and the lamps are burning low and everyone who is going to sleep has already gone to sleep. Hana moved her hands slightly in her lap, feeling the familiar mild stiffness of having sat very still for a long while, and thought about the ordinary things, whether the lamp needed oil, whether her daughter had enough blanket against the cool of the evening, whether the loose tile in the entryway should be attended to before it caused a problem. These thoughts arrived and were welcome, the way ordinary thoughts are welcome after a time of stillness, not breaking the feeling of the recitation, but settling softly alongside it, the way everyday life settles alongside the things it is quietly built around. Pause. She would not tell anyone outside this house what she had just done, which was something she had never found difficult. Not out of fear, the way it had once been fear across the generations when fear was necessary, but simply because it was private, and privacy was how it had survived, and old habits of protection have a way of persisting beyond the need for them. There was also this, that the thing she had just done was hers, and it had been theirs, Yuki's, and Yuki's grandmother's, and further still, and to explain it to someone who had not received it through the right hands, in the right room, in the right quiet, would have required words she did not have and perhaps did not want. What she would have said, if she had tried, was that it was a form of love, which would have sounded insufficient, she knew, but was actually quite close to the truth of it. Breath. 6 generations of love. She might have said, shaped like a prayer, even after the prayer had forgotten what it was praying, even after the words had become something other than words, even after the sound had softened and settled entirely into the rhythms of this particular island, this particular kind of autumn evening, this particular lamp burning in this particular still air. Yoichi had started something with fear or hope or both, and what it had grown into across all those lives and all those hands and all those careful whispers was something that felt on a quiet night like this one, much more like warmth than anything else. She reached over slowly and cupped her hand around the lamp to extinguish it, and the room went dark in the gentle way that rooms go dark when a single small source of light is gently removed. Pause. In the dark, she stayed still for a moment longer, the way you stay still in the dark after a lamp is put out, letting your eyes and your breath adjust to what the night actually holds. And in that darkness, in the silence after the rain, in the room that had been Yuki's room and Yuki's grandmother's room before that, she found, as she always found, that the company was still there, quiet and uncomplicated, without demand or explanation. Simply present the way certain things are present that have been present for a very long time. Pause. 400 years is a long time to sit in a room and wait for someone to say your prayer. And yet, in another way, it is not long at all, because the waiting has been warm and the room has always had a lamp, and the hands have always found the right other hands in time. And that perhaps is where this particular evening rests, in the dark after the flame, in the quiet after the rain, in the long, unbroken warmth of a sound that has traveled further than meaning can go, and arrived, still soft, still present, still somehow entirely itself. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way all things fade when the mind finally loosens its grip, quietly, without ceremony, like a candle drawing down to its last soft glow. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath move slowly, in and out, settling you a little deeper into the warmth wherever you are resting. Our next story waits for you gently. The same night unfolding, the same still air, carrying us forward without effort, without interruption. You need only remain here, just as you are, and let the words come to you. In a village where the river ran quietly behind the houses, a woman named Hana stood in the earthen entryway of her family's home very late at night, holding in both of her hands a small carved figure wrapped in a cloth the color of old autumn leaves, and she had made up her mind that tonight was the night she would finally let it go. She had told herself this before, many times in the slow weeks between one season and the next, in the particular darkness just before dawn, when all decisions seem possible and even the most difficult things seem, for a moment, manageable. But tonight felt different, or she had decided it would feel different, which is not quite the same thing. She was not young, Hana, not in the way that allows a person to be careless with old things. And yet she was not so old that she had stopped arguing with herself. And the argument that had been running inside her for some months now was the kind that does not resolve but simply wears you thin until you do something just to stop the wearing. The night was mild and still, and the village slept with that deep and total commitment that small villages have. Every house sealed against the dark, every paper screen unlit, the lane outside her door empty in both directions as far as she could see in the thin silver light that came from the moon. She wore her mother's heavy coat, which was too warm for the weather, but which she had reached for without thinking, and there was something in its weight across her shoulders that she was grateful for, in the way you are grateful for the right kind of pressure when a thing feels unsteady. The path to the river ran behind a row of houses, between two garden walls made of stacked river stones, and she had walked it so many times across the years of her life that her feet knew it without her eyes, knew where the path dipped slightly at the third stone, where the wall leaned in a little on the left side, where the grass grew long at the edge and whispered softly against the hem of a coat. She could hear the river before she reached it, a low and continuous sound, not quite a murmur and not quite a sigh, but something between them, something that had its own texture and temperature, the sound of water that has been moving through the same valley for longer than anyone can remember and expects to keep moving long after everyone is gone. The figure in her hands was small, small enough to fit entirely within one palm if she closed her fingers around it. And it had been in her family so long that the wood had darkened and smoothed to something like old honey, worn most at the places where fingers had held it most often, so that there were two shallow places on its sides that fit a thumb precisely, as if the wood had learned, over generations, the shape of the hands that would carry it. She had grown up knowing what it was, and she had spent most of her adult life wishing, at intervals, that she did not know, because knowing had made her the keeper of something she had never asked to keep, and the weight of that, not the physical weight, which was nothing, but the other weight, the one that sits in the chest slightly to the left and does not go away with sleep, had sometimes been harder than she thought it should be. The river came into view as she turned the corner of the last wall, a low silver movement in the moonlight, wider than its sound had suggested and slower. The reeds along the far bank standing absolutely still in the windless night, their reflections in the water barely distinguishable from the reeds themselves. She stood at the edge of the path and looked at the water for a long time, and somewhere in the looking she had stopped moving and was simply standing, the cloth-wrapped figure held against her chest now, under the lapel of the coat, as if she had decided without deciding to bring it closer rather than hold it out. She had rehearsed this in her mind many times. Let it happen in the hours before sleep, when the mind is permissive and allows things to be simpler than they are. And in the rehearsal, it had always been a clean movement, a leaning forward, an opening of the hands, a small sound when the figure entered the water, and then the water closing over it, and then nothing, and then the particular quiet that follows the end of a long responsibility. But the river was there now, and she was there, and her hands would not open. She moved closer to the bank, the grass cold and wet against her sandals, and she crouched at the very edge, looking down at the water, which was dark and steady and entirely indifferent, the way rivers are with no opinion about what arrives on their banks at any hour, taking whatever is brought to them with the same calm patience they bring to everything. She thought about her grandmother, Yuki, who had given her this figure on a winter evening a long time ago, pressing it into Hana's hands with a steadiness that had left no room for hesitation, holding Hana's fingers closed around the wooden shape and waiting, with the patience of someone who has learned to wait, until Hana had stopped trembling. Yuki had not explained very much. She had never been a woman who explained more than was absolutely necessary. But there had been something in the way she held Hana's hands around the figure, a quality of care that was also a quality of necessity, that communicated everything that words might have labored over and still not quite reached. The wood had been warm from Yuki's hands, and Hana had been surprised by that the warmth of one person could pass in a wood and wait there for the next person. And she found herself thinking now, crouched at the river's edge in the cold, that the warmth from her grandmother's hands was still in the wood somehow, layered beneath all the subsequent warmth, the way old voices persist in the walls of old houses, present beneath the ordinary sounds of the present. She stayed at the river's edge for a long time, long enough that the cold of the night began to come through the coat's thick wool, long enough that the sound of the water grew familiar in the way familiar sounds do, fading into the texture of the moment until it was simply there, neither noticed nor not noticed, like the sound of one's own breathing. She thought about Yoichi, the first of them, the one who had begun it all so many generations ago, about whom she knew almost nothing except that he had made a choice in a season of great fear, a choice to hide something rather than surrender it, and that the consequence of that choice was still here, in her hands, tonight, on a bank he could not have imagined standing on, in a world that had changed in every particular except for the small figure and the obligation of its keeping. She had sometimes felt something like anger toward Yoichi, in the way you can feel angry at someone you have never met, angry that he had not simply let it go in the beginning, when letting go would have been so much less complicated before it had gathered all the weight of all the subsequent hands and all the subsequent years and become this thing she was holding a riverbank at midnight. But standing at the water tonight, in the cold and the stillness and the thin moonlight, she found that the anger was not where she had left it, and what was in its place was something quieter and much harder to name, something that might have been sorrow, and might have been tenderness, and might have been both of those things at once, tangled too closely together to separate. She held the figure out over the water, her arm extended, the sleeve of the coat falling back to expose her wrist to the cool air, and she felt the slight change in her balance as her weight moved forward and the river moved below her, dark and silver and entirely unconcerned. She waited for the feeling of letting go, the feeling she had imagined so many times, the cleanness of it, the finality, but what she felt instead was a kind of heaviness in her arm, not in the muscles, not in the bone, but somewhere deeper in whatever part of the body is in charge of the things we carry for people who can no longer carry them themselves. And then her arm came back. She did not decide to bring it back, or if she did, the decision happened somewhere below the level of deciding, in the same quiet place where the decision to breathe happens, without consultation, without ceremony, simply as the next thing the body needed to do. She sat back from the edge and held the figure against her chest and breathed, and the river breathed alongside her in its own way. And the reeds did not move, and the moon did not move, and the night held everything in the same even light it had been holding since she arrived. She had not let go, and she sat with it the way you sit with something you have just learned about yourself that you did not entirely know before. Not with judgment and not with relief, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, a noting of a fact. After a while she rose and turned from the river and walked back along the path between the garden walls, and the coat was the same weight it had always been, and the figure was in her hands the same as before, and the village was asleep in the same way it had been when she left, and she let herself in through the low door and stood for a moment in the entryway where the night had started. She set the figure back in its place on the shelf behind the small cabinet door that kept it from casual sight, and the wood made the faintest sound against the wood of the shelf, barely a sound at all. And then it was still, and she was still, and the house was still, and she had the sense that the house had known she was coming back before she had known it herself. She lay down on her futon and pulled the blanket over her, and the room was dark, and the air was cool, and the only sound was the very faint murmur of the river, which reached this far on a quiet night, if you were quiet enough yourself to hear it. Sleep came slowly, the way it comes after a night when something has happened that you cannot fully account for yet, and she let it come. Let the room soften around her. Let the day's particulars grow less precise, until the night was simply the night, and the figure was on the shelf, and the river ran on beyond the wall, and nothing had changed, and everything had settled. Across the lane, in the small room attached to the neighboring temple, the monk Yoichi was sitting with his lamp burned very low, as he often was in the hours past midnight, not from sleeplessness in the anxious way, but from the wakefulness that comes with old age, the body's habit of offering itself back to the dark before the dark is entirely done with the day. He was old, Yoichi, in the way that certain people are old without it being the most important thing about them. Old the way a tree is old, the record of years present but not advertised, the surface giving little away except a particular quality of stillness and an air of having remained through weathers that changed everything around them. He had lived beside this family's house for most of his life, and the family had lived beside his temple for longer than either of them could precisely say, and the arrangement had suited both sides in the way that long adjacency becomes its own form of understanding, built not out of conversation, but out of the accumulated texture of shared seasons. He had first begun to suspect something about the family years ago, not from anything they did wrong or anything they neglected, but from a quality in the way they attended to ceremony, a quality he could not have precisely described, only that it reminded him of a person speaking a language fluently who had learned it from someone who spoke it slightly differently. An almost imperceptible accent of devotion that did not quite match the tradition they appeared to belong to. He had told himself for a long time that he was imagining it, because it was simpler to imagine that he was imagining it, and because it was very probably true, and because the alternative required him to think carefully about what a person does with a thing they have noticed that they were perhaps not meant to notice. But there had been an evening, some years into his wondering, when he had been walking the temple garden at dusk, and had seen through a gap in the hedge of quality of light in the family's house. The arrangement of the lamp, the posture of someone at a shelf that told him, without ambiguity, without detail, only by its whole shape, that what was happening in that room was a form of prayer, and that the form was not the one he had been taught to recognize. He had looked and then looked away and gone back inside, and he had not looked through that gap again. Not because the gap had closed, but because he had decided quietly and without ceremony that he had seen enough. He was a monk, and the life of a monk is in many ways the life of someone who has spent long years learning what to hold and what to release, what to pursue and what to let alone, and the understanding his years had arrived at, in this particular matter, on this particular lane, had settled firmly on the side of letting alone. He had never reported them, not to the temple's administration, not to the officials who came occasionally and asked their careful questions about the neighborhood families. And he had not experienced this as a failure of duty, because the duty he felt most fully was not the duty to the regulation, but the duty to the people who lived next to him. People he had watched across many decades bring offerings to his temple in years of grief and years of celebration. People whose children had played in the lane outside his gate. When officials asked their questions, he had answered simply and truly. The family was quiet. They maintained their obligations. There was nothing that required noting, and all of this was accurate. And he had not felt dishonesty in saying it, because there was nothing in what he had seen that required noting in the way the officials meant. He had thought about this distinction many times in the early mornings when the incense was still new and the light came sideways through the paper screen, turning it slowly the way you turn a stone to look at all its surfaces, and each time he arrived at the same place. That mercy, in order to be mercy, must sometimes involve a careful management of what one notices, and that this is not the same as dishonesty. Though he understood why a person might confuse them, he did not think of himself as a courageous man, and he would not have used that word for what he had done. It seemed to him very small, very simple. Only the decision made once, and then remade every morning without fanfare, that a life lived in the quiet practice of not causing unnecessary harm is a life that asks very little of the dramatic vocabulary of courage. On this particular night, as the lamp burned low in his room and the garden beyond the paper screen was a darkness he knew by heart, he had heard, very faintly, footsteps on the path, going, and then, after a long interval, returning. He did not look, and he did not need to know who it was, because the quality of the returning footsteps, something in their pace, something in their weight, some quality that belongs to a person who has set a decision down and picked up a different one, told him what he needed to know, which was that whatever had gone out had come back, and that the night had resolved itself in the way that was to his mind the right way. He sat for a long time after the footsteps had faded, the lamp no longer bright enough to read by, and felt something in his chest that was not quite relief, but was close to it. The particular ease that comes when a thing you have carried quietly in the background of your awareness for a very long time resolves itself without your intervention, in the way things sometimes do when given enough time and enough gentleness. He had never prayed formally for this family. That would have been strange. To pray to one tradition on behalf of another he only partly understood, But there were mornings when he had sat with the incense and let his attention rest on the house next door. And if what he felt then was not prayer, it was at least the same quality of wishing well for something you cannot protect, but would protect if you could. He blew out what remained of the lamp and sat in the darkness, which was the warm, familiar darkness of a room he had sat in for decades. And the wood of the walls settled around him in the way old wood settles at night, a sound so known to him that it had long since ceased to be a sound and had become simply the texture of the silence. He thought about what this family carried. He did not know exactly what it was, only that it was old and that it had been kept with great difficulty and great faithfulness, and that both of those things were true at the same time, which is harder than people often acknowledge, because difficulty and faithfulness do not always make comfortable companions. He understood faithfulness in his way, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself and asks for witnesses, but the quiet kind, the daily kind, the kind that consists mostly of doing the same small thing again and again, even when the doing is inconvenient, even on the days when the habit feels more like obligation than like devotion, and you do it anyway, because the doing is the point. His silence had been that kind of faithfulness, renewed every morning, asking nothing from anyone, making no claim, simply present the way a good neighbor is present across a garden wall through the ordinary years of an ordinary life. There's a kind of mercy he had come to believe over those long years that does not announce itself and does not require a witness and ask for no return. A mercy so quiet and so consistent that the people receiving it may not know they are receiving anything at all, only that some days, for reasons they cannot fully account for, the world sits slightly more lightly than it might. That was what he had given, in his small way, over the years, a lightening, however modest, of what they had to carry. And it had cost him almost nothing, which sometimes made him wonder whether it counted. And he had decided that it did, that a thing does not have to be costly to be real, that the smallest shelter offered consistently is still shelter. He lay down on his pallet eventually, the blanket thin and familiar, and the room was dark in the way his room was always dark at the end of a day, and the garden was quiet, and the lane beyond the gate was quiet, and the sound of the river came to him very faintly, the same murmur it always made, entirely itself, the way rivers are. He did not sleep quickly. He rarely did, but lay in the place between sleep and waking that felt, at his age, less like an edge and more like a room of its own, a place where the day's particulars dissolve into something softer, where the things you have held through the hours release themselves gently, the way tension releases from a held breath when the breath is finally let go. He thought, in that softening, about silence, not the silence of absence, not the silence of indifference, but the silence that is a choice made deliberately and renewed each morning, the silence that says only this: I see you, and I will not make what is already difficult more difficult, and that is the most I can offer, and I offer it. Across the lane, Hana had found sleep, the house quiet around her, the figure on the shelf in the dark, the faint sound of the river reaching her room through the still night air. The village rested under the thin moonlight, and the river moved on through the dark in the same direction it had always moved, carrying whatever floated to it, Leaves, light, the sound of distant water, carrying it all the same way, without preference, without memory, without any opinion at all about what passes along its banks. The 7 generations of that house had lived their long silence beside this temple, and the monk had kept his long silence beside their house, and neither side had spoken of what both of them, in their different ways, already knew. And perhaps that was exactly as it should have been, because some things are most fully honored in the space between them, in what is not said, in what is simply given room to remain. And that, perhaps, is where this night rests, in the quiet of a house that held on when holding was difficult, in the mercy of a man who saw clearly and chose, with great gentleness, not to speak, in the small carved figure on the shelf in the dark, still holding, in its old wood, the warmth of every pair of hands that had carried it to the edge of letting go and brought it home again. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade gently, the way a half-remembered dream dissolves before you can quite hold it. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders settle a little deeper into the warmth beneath you. The night is still wide open, and you have nowhere to be. Our next story does not begin somewhere new. It simply continues. The same quiet night unfolding. The same unhurried darkness carrying us forward. There's only this soft thread leading on, and all you need to do is follow it, easy and slow, as the next chapter finds you wherever you already are. Somewhere in a low, still room beside the old temple, in the last warmth of a late afternoon, Rin sat with the small oil-wrapped booklet open across his palms, and the silence around him was the kind that seemed to listen back. He had set it down a dozen times that afternoon and picked it back up again, turning the pages with the care one uses for something that might not survive too much handling. And each time he opened to the beginning, to those first transcribed lines of worn, unfamiliar sound, he felt the same quiet pull in the region of his throat. Not quite recognition, because he had never learned Latin, but something close to it, something that lived below language and did not require language to make. It's self-known. The script itself was beautiful in a specific, tender way. Not because it was grand, but because it was small, the brush strokes of someone who had practiced this handwriting over many years, who had chosen every character with something approaching reverence, and who had written the whole of it. Rin had slowly come to understand, knowing full well that no one who could properly read these sounds would likely ever come. He had spent 3 days researching what the sounds were, sitting in a library with high, cold ceilings, asking a priest he found by accident in a side corridor, who went momentarily still before answering, and eventually sitting across from an elderly scholar who had devoted 40 years of his life to what he called the hidden Christians of Western Japan, who had looked at the first page in a long silence, and then said, softly, that this was a prayer. A prayer the scholar had mentioned that was 400 years old at minimum. Pause. Rin had written that down his notebook the way he wrote down measurements or timber specifications, carefully, without drama, and had only understood somewhere on the long train ride home with the booklet resting against his chest in his jacket pocket, what that number actually contained. 400 years was not a long time in all parts of the world, but in this particular history, 400 years was the whole of the hiding, the full silent length of it. And somewhere on that train, he had felt something shift in his understanding the way a floor shifts slightly underfoot, and you realize without alarm that you're standing on very old ground. By the time the train pulled into his station, he had known that he was going to read the prayers aloud, though he could not have said exactly when the decision had formed, only that it had, the way certain decisions do, not arrived at through deliberation, but simply discovered already present, waiting quietly for him to notice them. He read the first page again now, silently, moving only his eyes, the sounds assembling themselves in his mind in the shape the scholar had taught him. A soft Latin phrase, which had become something more like a Japanese breath over the centuries, rounded at the edges and worn smooth by how many thousand silent repetitions he could not say. Pause. And then, without quite deciding to, he let one word out. It was almost nothing, a murmur barely louder than the sound of his own breathing. Something between a test and an apology, a single syllable released into the still air of the room and then gone. The way a stone dropped into very still water sends one slow ring outward and then simply settles. Breath. He stopped. He listened. The room was exactly the same. The dust in the slant of afternoon light did not rearrange itself in recognition of what had just happened. But something had shifted in the smallest possible way, and he knew it the way you know when a window has been opened in another room, not by any evidence you could name, but by a slight, almost imperceptible change in the quality of the air, a new movement in the stillness where there had been none before. He read another line aloud, following the scholar's phonetic guide with one careful finger, and his voice sounded strange to him, the way voices always sound strange when they are being asked to do something they were not expecting, uncertain and thin and private in the quiet room. The Latin syllables in their Japanese-worn shapes moving through the air and softening and dissolving, leaving nothing visible behind them. There's a thing that happens when you speak very old words. The person who first spoke them becomes, for a moment, almost present, the way a person's hand is present in a letter written long ago, identifiable by the weight of the loops, the downstrokes, the places where the pen hesitated and the places where it did not. The person who had written these particular words had not left a name. Pause. The last page of the booklet. Not the prayers themselves, but the small memoir the scholar had helped her and read. The careful record of 7 generations tucked between the prayer pages ended simply with a sentence the scholar had translated for him as something like, "I am the last who knows these sounds, and I am placing them here so that someone may someday find them." That was all. No name, no date in any system run could decipher. Only that single quiet sentence, and then the careful folding of the oil paper and the long, slow climb up to the space between the beams. Rena tried to picture it on the train home. It tried again now, sitting in the low room with the evening coming on. An old person, he thought of them as old, though they might have been only middle-aged, worn to oldness by the long practice of keeping, in a room not unlike this one, beside a lamp burning on its last oil, writing the final notes slowly, the way people write when they are aware that each stroke may be among the last they make. The lamp would have been oil, The floor tatami, perhaps older than the lamp itself. The walls would have held the particular chill that old wooden walls hold in early autumn. And outside, whatever year it was, whatever version of this country the world was offering then, the sounds of a night would have been as ordinary as they always are, a wind moving through cedar branches, something small in the underbrush, the distant sound of water going about its business without anyone asking it. 2. Pause. The last keeper would have written slowly, not from hesitation but from long habit. 7 generations of carefulness had made slowness the only natural speed, and there was no urgency now, not with the era of hiding bending toward its end like a branch bearing too much winter snow, not yet fallen, but feeling the weight of it and aware. When the note was finished, the last keeper would have sat with it for some time, reading it back once or twice, perhaps making a small correction to character, or perhaps only sitting with it the way you sit with a letter before sealing it, giving yourself a last moment in the company of what you have written before it passes out of your hands. Then the folding. The oiled paper first, smooth and careful and pressed flat against the pages, and then wrapped again tighter still, the hands pressing out the air because air is the enemy of old paper, and if someone in some future time was going to find this, it needed to be more patient than the years intended to be kind, needed to last past whatever came next. Breath. The climb up to the rafters would have been slow. Old joints carry the memory of old floors, and the space between the beams would have been dark, smelling of timber and old dust, and something else, something with no proper name, only the particular quality that very old, very enclosed spaces accumulate over the years, a kind of concentrated stillness. The last keeper would have reached in and found the place between the beams where the booklet fit without straining and set it down with both hands, and then withdrawn and descended and stood for a moment looking up at the ceiling at the place where it now rested, knowing it was there and no one else knew, feeling something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but was the calm that arrives when you have completed the last thing a long task required of you. Pause. They had not expected Run. They had not imagined him specifically. A young carpenter with careful hands and a good eye for old timber, standing on a scaffold in a century they could not have conceived of, but they had imagined someone, some future person who would find the booklet and understand enough to recognize what it was, and that imagining had been enough, had been the whole reason for the writing and the folding and the careful placing in the dark between the beams. There is something enormous in that. Ren found himself thinking that a person could complete their work and leave it in the dark, trusting that a reader who did not yet exist would someday come, and find that trust sufficient, find the bare possibility of being found worth more than certainty, worth more, in some sense, than any promise. That the not yet existing reader was enough. That the mere possibility of finding was sufficient reason to do the writing. Long pause. He read the next line aloud, and the one after that, and his voice grew a little more settled in the sounds. The way a path becomes a path after you have walked it a few times, the grass pressed down just enough to show where your feet should go. The prayers themselves were formless to him in one sense. He understood nothing of their content. The Latin worn too far past recognition for even the scholar to fully restore. But they were not random. They had a rhythm that moved in long, slow waves, slightly irregular like breathing, or like the sound of someone reading quietly in a room nearby, just audible through a wall. He followed the rhythm rather than the meaning, letting the sounds carry whatever meaning 4 centuries of practice had accumulated in them. Not trying to impose anything from outside, but letting the words be what they had become, which was perhaps the most respectful approach available to him. And this was the thing he had not expected, had not known to expect. The sounds were not foreign. Pause. They had been in this country too long, shaped by too many Japanese mouths, even silent mouths, even mouths only moving in the dark beneath a futon, late at night when the house was breathing with sleep around them. And they had taken on something of this place, something in the register of reading sutra in the long sustained vowels and the small catches of breath between phrases, so that they sounded less like borrowed prayer and more like something very old that had always been from. Here, Yoichi had begun it all, in the first generation, hiding the small carved figure behind the familiar and merciful face of Canon, the goddess of mercy, so that he could pray in 2 directions at once without drawing the attention of the world. And 4 centuries of that hidden, double practice had done something to the sounds themselves, had worn them into the shape of this country the way a river stone is shaped by the specific water that moves over it, smoothed into belonging by. Nothing more than time and contact. Pause. Rin found himself thinking about Yoichi at some length, about the man at the very beginning of all of this, a farmer, ordinary by his own reckoning, who had made a decision in a frightened season that was neither brave nor cowardly, but was simply what he could bear to do, and who had not known, standing there with his hidden figure and his doubled prayer, that he was beginning something that would outlast him by 400 years, and in one afternoon in a low room with a young. Carpenter's voice finally sang the words in open air. Yoichi had not known any of this. He had only known what the next morning required of him. Rin read on through the middle pages, where the prayers grew longer in their worn way, the syllables clustering in patterns of 3 and 4, the rhythm shifting subtly, and he followed it as best he could, his voice low and unhurried in the room, the afternoon light outside moving slowly and without fuss toward evening. Pause. He thought about Yuki, the grandmother in the 5th generation, who had chosen one grandchild from among several to receive the secret, the most patient, the most careful, and had drawn that child close one night and whispered the sounds into the child's ear, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she was entrusting. The trembling of someone who knows they are passing something irreplaceable and cannot be certain the passing will hold. He thought about Hana, 2 generations further along, who had stood in the cold winter line for the Fumi, the copper plate laid on the frozen ground, and had placed her foot upon the carved image without a word, and had walked home in the gray afternoon and knelt in untouched snow and drawn a cross with one finger, just once, and had sat back on her heels and watched the snow fall quietly over it, covering it the way snow covers everything, without judgment, without hurry. Pause. And Ren was speaking those prayers now, in a room with 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor, in a voice that traveled across the room and met the walls and softly came back, which no one in 7 generations of this family had allowed these sounds to do. Breath. He paused between pages, holding the booklet gently, looking up at the low ceiling with its old varnish, thinking about the space between the beams of the temple roof and the quality of patience required of paper resting in darkness for decades. Not the patience of a person who always has the option of giving up, but the patience of ink and paper, which simply endure in whatever darkness they are placed and wait without needing to understand why. He read on. There were pages that had clearly been loved more than others. The ink slightly thicker in certain passages, the corners of certain pages worn more than the rest, the grain of the paper at these places rubbed smooth by what must have been many careful thumbs over many years. And it was plain that whoever had handled the booklet through the generations had returned to these particular sounds again and again, had folded back to these pages in the dark and pressed their lips silently against these syllables as if they were the most essential ones, the ones that carried the most of whatever it was the prayer was carrying. He did not know which generation had needed these pages most, or what in them had felt so necessary in the night hours. Pause. It might have been the monk Daichi, who had lived near this family for some period of his long life and had known or quietly guessed what they were carrying and had chosen silence as his response to that knowledge. His silence a kind of shelter, a roof held over them without their asking, which is perhaps the most useful kind of shelter there is. Or it might have been a child in the 3rd or 4th generation, going through a difficult winter, drawn to these particular pages for reasons the child could not have put into words, but which amounted to something like, "These sounds feel like a hand on my back, and I do not need to know what they mean in order to feel that." The language had been incomprehensible for generations and had remained beloved regardless, which is a thing that happens with prayer more often than people admit. The meaning retreats, and what remains is the rhythm of the mouth and the shape the tongue makes against the palate, the particular quality of attention the sounds call up in the whole body, which is its own kind of meaning, perhaps the oldest kind of meaning there is. He was near the end of the prayers now, the last few pages, the handwriting slightly more labored here, the strokes broader and a little less certain, as if the hand that transcribed these final pages had been tired, or very careful with the last of its strength, or simply old in a way that showed in the ink. Pause. He read the final lines with the same unhurried voice he had used throughout, not trying to make the ending significant, not performing anything, just completing the reading the way one completes a careful task, with the same quality of attention from the first page to the last, neither more nor less. The last syllable was a sound that trailed off softly, as so many of the sounds in this prayer did, a gentle diminuendo, a breath dissolving in a breath. And then it was gone, and the room was quiet again, but a different quiet than before. Pause. Rin sat for a while with the booklet closed in his hands, not moving, listening to the particular quality of quiet that follows reading aloud, which is a slightly fuller quiet than the quiet that precedes it, as if the air has been changed in some small way by the passage of sound through it, has received something it did not have before and does not yet know what to do with. The late light outside had moved fully toward dusk, and the walls had darkened by a shade, and somewhere near the old temple, A bird had begun the kind of low, unhurried call that birds make in the early evening, not to be heard, perhaps, but simply as an expression of their own continuing, ordinary existence. He thought about the word throat, not abstractly, but in the specific physical sense. The column of air and muscle and vibration through which everything he had just said had passed, and through which 7 generations had not been permitted to let these sounds pass, and through which Yoichi, for centuries ago, may have sung a work song to his children in the open air of a summer evening, not yet aware of what was coming, not yet carrying anything heavier than a day's ordinary fatigue. Breath, his own throat felt, used was the closest word, in the gentle sense of a tool employed for its proper purpose, the quiet and unremarkable satisfaction of having done the thing one was made for. The sounds that belonged to everyone and to no one for so long, held in the mouths of people who could not speak them, in the hands of people who could not write them, resting in the dark of old rafters where no one came to listen. And now they had passed through him once, in the low afternoon of an ordinary working day, and gone into the air, and the air had received them and made nothing particular of it, which seemed exactly right, which seemed precisely what the moment called for. There was no ceremony. Pause. There was only run, and the booklet, and the room, and the faint residual warmth in the old walls from the day that was ending, and the bird outside, and the quiet settling back around him the way water settles after something has passed through it. He would, in the months that followed, hand the booklet to the scholar, who would study it with great care and eventually write about it, and the words would be reconstructed as fully as possible, and people would read about them in languages that had no connection to either Latin or Japanese, and photographs of the pages would appear in books with careful academic descriptions alongside them. And all of that would be right. All of that would be the appropriate next step, the world doing what it does with things it recovers. But none of that would be the first time. Pause. The first time was already done, woven now into the fabric of what had happened, and therefore permanent. More permanent in some sense than any paper. A young carpenter's uncertain voice finding its way through prayers it did not fully understand, in a low room on an ordinary afternoon, with the dust still moving slowly in the slant of the last light. He thought of Yoichi once more, briefly and without pressure, the man at the beginning, the ordinary farmer who had made a decision that required no heroism, only a patient kind of faithfulness, continued day after day for a lifetime, and then passed on to the next person like a set of well-kept tools, used and handed forward and used again. Yoichi had never heard these prayers spoken aloud either, not in any language, not in any form, because the priest had already been gone from that region when the hiding began, and the prayers had been transmitted from the very start as sound alone, stripped of the ceremony that usually holds such things together, and they had held together anyway. Pause. And yet Yoichi had kept them, had passed them on, had found them worth the keeping. There is something in that which resists being fully grasped. The way it sits quietly at the edge of understanding, not demanding to be explained, only asking to be acknowledged. The way the long patience of ordinary people asks, in the end, only that much. To be acknowledged, not celebrated, not analyzed, only seen for what it was. Outside, the dusk had deepened without announcement, and the bird had gone quiet, and the low room held its darkness gently now, without weight. The darkness of a place that is simply old and still, which is a different quality of darkness entirely from the darkness of a place that has known fear. Long pause. Rin set the booklet down on the table beside him. Not putting it away. Not yet. Just setting it down to rest. The way you set down something you have been carrying for a while, without quite realizing how long you have been carrying it. The room was quiet, and the evening was settling in the ordinary way evenings settle. And somewhere in the old wood of the walls, in the patience of old timber that has held its shape through many seasons, something of those 7 generations remained, not as weight, not as sorrow, but as the particular quality that long faithfulness leaves in the places where it was practiced, a warmth just below the threshold of naming. Something between a memory and a presence, too quiet to disturb and too persistent to disappear. The booklet rested on the table with the patience it had always had. Pause, and that perhaps is where this story rests. Not at an ending exactly, but at a kind of arrival, the quiet place where something that has been waiting a very long time finally, gently, does not have to wait any longer. And so we have reached the end of tonight's stories. All the voices have grown quiet now. The threads of each life we followed, the choices made, the silences kept, the small and enormous moments that shape a person. They settle gently, like leaves coming to rest on still water.